Out of the car. You reach for anything. Anything. And I will put you face down on this asphalt. The flashlight hit her eyes before she could blink. High beam, deliberate, the kind that turned a human face into a white blot. Featureless, interchangeable, already guilty. She didn't reach. Didn't flinch. Her hands stayed on the steering wheel, 10 and 2, exactly where she'd placed them the instant the blue lights painted her rearview mirror. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't change. He crumpled her registration without reading a single line and threw it into the gravel. In 10 hours, his own lawyer would read that same name on a case file and forget how to breathe. But right now, on the shoulder of Interstate 85, mile marker 58, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. Right now, she was just a black woman in a Mercedes. And that, apparently, was enough. The dispatch log would later confirm what started this. A single anonymous call, 19 seconds long, no callback number, no physical description of a driver, no plate confirmation. Just 6 words fed into the system like poison into a well. Luxury vehicle, I-85 South, probably stolen. Probably. Not is, not confirmed. Probably. The language of suspicion dressed up as civic duty. The kind of word that launched 1,000 traffic stops and ruined lives without ever being held accountable. She stepped out, slowly. Palms open, turned outward, visible under the sodium lights. Every movement deliberate, weight shifting from left foot to right, door closing with her hip, never once reaching behind her, never once dropping her hands below her waistline. The gravel crunched under boots that weren't hers. He was already close. Too close. The kind of close that wasn't procedure. It was pressure. Hands on the roof. She placed them flat. Metal cold through her palms, October air biting her wrists where her coat sleeves rode up. This your car? Yes. Registration says otherwise. You didn't read it. The silence lasted 2 full seconds. Then his hand landed on her shoulder, hard, sudden, the heel of his palm driving into the joint. He spun her around and slammed her sideways into the car door. The impact cracked through her ribcage, dull and deep. Her coat sleeve caught on the door handle and tore. A clean rip, fabric separating at the seam, exposing lining. She didn't cry out, didn't gasp, just absorbed the force, let it pass through her the way deep water absorbs a stone. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes stayed open, and she did not say the one sentence that would have ended everything. Not yet. If this story already has you locked in, subscribe now, because what just happened on that highway is only the first 3 minutes of the worst night of his career. 6 hours earlier, the light in her office was the last one burning on the 3rd floor. Corinne Bellamy sat behind a desk that held exactly what it needed and nothing more. A leather briefcase, dark brown, initials CB embossed on the brass clasp, rested open beside a stack of folders organized with color-coded tabs. Yellow for witness statements, orange for medical records, red for contradictions. Every page marked with the same 2 pens, red for underlining evidence lines, blue for questions she'd write in the margins. Small, precise handwriting. No wasted strokes. She was reading the same case file for the 3rd time. Not because she'd missed something, she hadn't, but because repetition was where patterns lived. The first read gave you facts. The second gave you sequence. The third gave you the thing the defense hoped you'd overlook. The gap between what happened and what was reported. She turned a page. Red pen underlined a sentence. Blue pen wrote 4 words in the margin, so small they'd require a magnifying glass to read from across the desk. She'd learned early, years ago, in a context she kept private, that notes visible to others became leverage for others. So she wrote small, always. The tab on the current folder read, State versus Hadley. Below it, in smaller type, excessive force, minor victim. She'd reviewed the medical photographs twice. A 16-year-old boy with bruising across his back consistent with a knee pressed into his spine, abrasions on his forearms from pavement contact. The kind of injuries that told a story the officer's report carefully omitted. She closed the folder, placed it in the briefcase, snapped the clasp shut. One clean click, the sound of a day's work sealed and stored. Then she reached for her coat on the back of the chair, slid her arms through the sleeves, and checked the office one final time. Lamp off, desk clear, chair pushed in, door locked. She tested the handle twice, a habit she couldn't remember starting but couldn't stop performing. 2 pulls, always. Then she walked down the corridor, heels clicking on marble, past darkened offices and closed doors, toward the parking garage where her Mercedes waited, in the same spot she always used. 3rd level, east corner, near the security camera she'd noted on her first day. She noticed things like that. Camera placements, exit routes, which lights were burned out and hadn't been replaced. Not because she was afraid, because knowing the layout of any space she occupied was a reflex, the kind that came from years of operating in environments where details meant the difference between preparation and surprise. The drive south on I-85 was 40 minutes of nothing. Charlotte thinning behind her, suburbs dissolving into dark stretches of pine and asphalt. She kept the radio on, a public station, classical, volume low enough to hear traffic sounds through the cracked window. Air helped her think. Cold air, especially. Her hands sat at 10 and 2. Speedometer steady at 67 in a 70 zone. She checked her mirrors every 30 seconds. Rear view, driver's side, rear view again. A rhythm so ingrained it ran on its own clock, independent of conscious thought. She'd been doing it for how long? She couldn't pinpoint the start, only that stopping felt like leaving a door unlocked. 22 miles from home, she pulled off at a Citgo station. Half a tank left, but she liked arriving with a full one. Another habit, the kind that came from someone who planned backward from worst-case scenarios rather than forward from best ones. Inside the convenience store, fluorescent light made everything look slightly ill. She set a bottle of water on the counter. The cashier, mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain, hands that moved like they'd scanned 10,000 items and stopped seeing any of them, looked up, looked at Corinne, looked past her, through the window, at the Mercedes parked under the canopy, then looked back at Corinne. The pause was 3 seconds, maybe 4, maybe long enough to notice, long enough to catalog. The cashier picked up Corinne's credit card, turned it over, read the name on the back, turned it over again, and ran it through the machine. Slowly. "Nice car," the cashier said. Not a compliment. An observation. The inflection carrying a question the words didn't ask. How does someone who looks like you drive something that looks like that? "Thank you." 2 words, flat, final, no explanation offered, no justification performed. She'd learned, a long time ago, across a career she didn't discuss with strangers, that explaining yourself to people who'd already decided what they were looking at only gave them more material to work with. She took the receipt, walked back to her car, and pulled onto the highway. 4 miles later, the headlights appeared. Not in front of her, behind her. 1 car length back, matching her speed exactly. She was doing 67. The car behind her was doing 67. She moved to the right lane. The car moved to the right lane. She returned to the center. So did the headlights. Corinne's eyes flicked to the rear view. The silhouette was wrong for a civilian vehicle. Too boxy, too low, antenna visible against the sky glow. Patrol car, running dark. No lights, no sirens. Just following. She kept her speed steady, hands at 10 and 2, signal on when she changed lanes. Every movement textbook, every action defensible, every choice designed to leave no opening for interpretation. Mile 1, mile 2, mile 3. The patrol car held position, 1 car length. Constant, mile 4, mile 4.25. Blue and red erupted in her mirror. No siren, just light, sudden and violent, painting the inside of her car in alternating colors that made the dashboard look like it was breathing. Corinne exhaled. Not a sigh. A controlled release, the kind that sent tension out through the teeth and left the body ready for whatever came next. She signaled right, slowed, pulled onto the gravel shoulder, killed the engine. Then she did something she'd practiced in her mind more times than she wanted to count. She placed both hands on the steering wheel, fingers spread, palms flat, and she waited. The boots on gravel took 11 seconds to reach her window. She counted. The flashlight hit the glass before the voice did. License and registration. She'd already prepared them. Not after the request. Before it. The moment the blue lights appeared, her left hand had moved to the visor where she kept her license clipped, and her right had opened the glove compartment where the registration waited in a clear sleeve. Both documents now rested between her index and middle fingers, extended through the half-open window. He didn't take them immediately. The flashlight moved from the documents to her face, then down to her lap, then to the passenger seat, then to the back seat. Scanning. Searching for something that justified what he'd already decided. Step out of the vehicle. She stepped out. That part she'd already lived through. The opening seconds of this encounter. The gravel, the cold, the hands on the roof. But here is where the sequence tightened, where the space between lawful and unlawful collapsed to a sliver. "This your car?" he asked for the second time, as if repetition could change the answer. "Yes, the registration confirms it." He held her license under the flashlight. "Rate it." Then looked at her, really looked, the beam moving from the photo on the card to the face in front of him and back, like he was comparing two things that shouldn't match. "Corinne Bellamy," he read aloud. "Dilworth address." "That's correct? And this is your Mercedes E-Class." "That is what the registration states. Yes." He turned the registration over, held it up to the light. Then, and the dash camera of the third vehicle on scene would later capture this in perfect digital clarity, he crumpled the document in his fist, bent his arm back, and threw it into the gravel shoulder, where it landed face up under the sodium lamp. Still legible, still valid, still proving everything he was choosing to ignore. "This car doesn't belong to you," he said. And the sentence wasn't a question, wasn't even an accusation. It was a declaration, a verdict delivered before trial by a man who'd appointed himself judge and jury on a dark stretch of highway, and the only evidence he needed was already visible. The car was expensive, the hour was late, and the driver was black. His name was Trent Hadley, 9 years on the force, patrol division, night shift by choice. He was 6'1", broad across the shoulders, the kind of build that turned a standard-issue uniform into a statement about physical authority. His partner, Sergeant Margot Delane, hadn't arrived yet, but her voice was already on the radio, calm and approving, confirming she was 3 minutes out. Corinne stood with her back to the car, hands still raised, palms out. She had not been told she was being detained, had not been told what crime she was suspected of, had not been read any rights, and she had been standing outside her own vehicle for less than 90 seconds, but the interaction had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Officer," she said, and her voice was the thing that should have warned him. It was calm, not the calm of surrender, not the calm of fear frozen into compliance. It was the calm of someone who had heard this exact tone of voice before, in recordings, in transcripts, in rooms where words were weighed and consequences were measured, and who knew precisely what it meant when a law enforcement officer declared facts before investigating them. "Officer, the registration is valid. You're holding my license. Both confirm ownership." "I'll be the one who decides what's confirmed." The radio crackled. A second set of headlights appeared in the distance, growing rapidly. The backup Hadley had requested before he'd even looked at her documents. What happened next took 4 seconds. He grabbed her right wrist, not her arm, her wrist, the narrowest point, where bones sat close to skin and pressure translated directly into pain. He yanked it down from the roof and twisted it behind her back. Her shoulder rotated in its socket, the tendons stretching past comfort and into the territory where the body sends distress signals to the brain, sharp and electric. She gasped. Once. The sound escaped before she could contain it. Involuntary, biological, the body's protest against mechanics it wasn't designed to endure. His other hand found her left wrist, pulled it down, crossed both behind her back. The handcuffs appeared. She heard the ratchet before she felt it, the mechanical clicking that preceded the bite of steel on skin. One cuff. Click, click, click. Too tight. The second cuff. Click, click. Tighter still. Metal edges pressing into the tendons of her inner wrist, hard enough that she could feel her pulse pushing against the restraint. "This is a mistake," she said. Quietly. Not a plea, a statement of fact, delivered with the same inflection she'd used to cite a statute number or read a finding into the record. "Sure it is." He laughed. Not a chuckle, an actual laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, somewhere that found real humor in the idea that this woman, might have a legitimate claim to the car, the road, the right to drive unmolested through the night. The second patrol car pulled up. No siren, lights cycling. The door opened, and Sergeant Margot Delane stepped out. 18 years on the force. Delane moved like someone who'd supervised enough scenes to own them on arrival. Her boots crunched gravel with a measured stride. Not rushing, not hesitating. She assessed in 3 seconds flat. The Mercedes, the woman, the expensive coat now torn at the sleeve, the calm voice, the complete absence of panic. All of it processed through a filter that had already reached its conclusion. She walked to Hadley, leaned close, low voice, the kind calibrated to stay off body cameras, the kind that traveled between partners and died before reaching suspects. "You sure about this one?" "Positive. Profile fits." Delane nodded, slowly, the nod of someone who'd heard that phrase before and never questioned what profile meant, because questioning meant acknowledging what the profile actually measured, and acknowledging meant accountability, and accountability meant paperwork that nobody wanted to file. "By the book, then. Document everything." By the book. Corinne heard it clearly. The gravel acoustics carried low voices better than either officer realized. She filed the phrase where she filed everything, in the systematic architecture of a mind trained to catalog language, context, and intent simultaneously. By the book wasn't procedure. It was code. It meant, make the paperwork match the story, not the facts. She knew this because she'd read that exact phrase, those exact 4 words, in that exact order, in dozens of internal reports, disciplinary files, and complaint summaries that crossed her desk. It appeared with statistical regularity in cases where officers needed to explain, after the fact, why they'd done what they'd done to people who looked like her. The thought surfaced without emotion. They've done this before. This isn't improvisation. This is routine. 15 feet behind them, a third patrol car sat with its engine idling. Officer Owen Ridley stood beside the driver's door. 24 years old, 7 months out of the academy. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon, not on his radio, just on the leather, the gesture of a man who didn't know what to do with his hands because he didn't know what to do with what he was seeing. His dash camera was running, had been running since he'd arrived on scene 3 minutes ago. The red light blinked steadily in the darkness, a small mechanical witness doing what the human witness could not bring himself to do. Corinne caught his reflection in the Mercedes's side mirror. Young face, unreadable expression, but his body language was loud. The way he stood slightly apart from the other two, the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, the way he looked at the ground whenever Hadley's voice rose. She recognized the posture. She'd seen it in courtrooms, in depositions, in the silence of people who knew something was wrong but hadn't yet decided whether knowing obligated them to act. She made eye contact with him through the mirror. He looked away. Too quickly. Hadley walked back to his patrol car, slid behind the wheel, punched Corinne's information into the mobile terminal. License number, registration, vehicle identification number. The screen loaded. He waited, fingers tapping the steering wheel in a rhythm that suggested impatience, not nerves. The radio clicked to life. Unit 47, this is dispatch. A woman's voice. Neutral. Professional. The cadence of someone reading data off a screen. Vehicle registration, Charlie Mike 7718, registered to Corinne Bellamy. Dilworth address, Charlotte. Clean record, no warrants. No stolen vehicle report on file. You're clear to proceed. Hadley stared at the screen. The words sat there. Clean record, no warrants, no stolen vehicle. In green letters on a black background. Each character a fact that contradicted the story he'd built in his head during 4 miles of following a luxury car driven by a black woman at midnight. The timestamp on the dispatch confirmation read 23:51, but the handcuffs had closed at 23:48, 3 minutes. He'd arrested her 3 minutes before the system told him there was nothing to arrest her for. Delane appeared at his window, leaned down. What'd it come back? Clean. He said the word like it offended him. But something's still off. Delane studied his face. Whatever she saw there, certainty, stubbornness, the refusal to admit error that turned minor mistakes into career-ending ones, she chose to validate rather than challenge. Trust your instincts. If it feels wrong, document it. Process her. We'll sort it at the station. Trust your instincts. The phrase that had launched 1,000 false arrests and survived 1,000 internal reviews, because instinct was the one justification that couldn't be disproven. It lived in the gut, not on paper, and guts didn't get subpoenaed. In the back of Hadley's patrol car, Corinne sat behind the partition, hands cuffed behind her back. The plastic seat was cold through her coat. The partition smelled like disinfectant and the faint residue of 100 prior passengers. Sweat, fear, the chemical tang of stress leaving the body through the skin. She'd heard the entire radio exchange, every word, crystal clear through the thin panel. Dispatch had confirmed the car was hers, confirmed her record was clean, confirmed there was no stolen vehicle report, and they were continuing anyway. Her jaw tightened, not from pain, though the cuffs were cutting shallow grooves into her wrists, but from the precise, clinical recognition of what she was witnessing from the inside. She'd read about this pattern, studied it, evaluated testimony describing it, and now she was living it, feeling it in her bones and her skin and the growing numbness in her fingertips where the steel was compressing the blood vessels. She was not afraid, she was calculating, thinking 3 moves ahead, deciding when to speak and when to stay silent, and which silence would cost her more, the silence of compliance or the silence of strategy. She chose strategy. Speaking now would accomplish nothing. Arguing on the side of I-85 with 2 officers who'd already committed to their narrative was like arguing with a verdict after the gavel had already fallen. The time for speaking was later, in a room designed for it, under conditions she controlled. So she waited. Hadley exited his patrol car and walked back to the Mercedes, flashlight sweeping the interior through the windows. Passenger seat, back seat, floor mats. Then he opened the passenger door. The briefcase sat on the seat. Dark brown leather, well worn at the corners, the initials CB in brass catching the flashlight beam. He picked it up, not carefully, not with the measured touch of someone handling another person's property. He lifted it by the handle, swung it onto the hood of the patrol car, and unsnapped the clasp. Inside, folders. Color-tabbed, organized, labeled in small handwriting. Legal documents, case files, business cards in a leather holder, cream-colored stock, embossed text, a seal in the upper left corner. He pulled one out, read it under the flashlight. The card read, Corinne Bellamy, followed by a title, an address, and a phone number. The seal was official. The paper was heavy. The embossing was real. He could feel it under his thumb. the raised letters pressed into the cardstock with the kind of institutional precision that didn't come from a home printer. He flipped through the folders, found a tab on one file, State versus Hadley. His thumb paused on the label. Hadley was a common name. His brain registered the coincidence and immediately dismissed it. Ego functioning as expected, filtering out information that threatened the narrative already under construction. He closed the briefcase, carried it to where Delane stood by the Mercedes's rear bumper. "Anything?" she asked. He held up one of the business cards. "She's got official credentials, professional job, good quality paper." Delane took the card, turned it over, ran her thumb across the seal. "Fake," she said. The word came out flat, without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt. "Book her for false impersonation too. Public official. That's a felony." She said it like she was reading from a menu. Item added. Total updated. Next. From behind the partition, Corinne heard every word. The accusation, false impersonation of a public official, a felony under North Carolina general statutes, landed on credentials that were not only real, but carried the weight of an authority that neither officer had bothered to verify through the one phone call that would have confirmed everything. "Officer," her voice came through the partition. Controlled. The fury was there. She could feel it pressing against the back of her teeth, but she held it behind the professional composure that years of discipline had forged into something close to armor. "I strongly advise you to verify my identity before you proceed further. This will not end the way you think it will." Hadley slammed the briefcase shut. The clasp snapped like a small bone breaking. "They all try this," he said to Delane, shaking his head, smiling. Actually smiling. The smile of a man who believed he'd seen this play before and already knew how it ended. "High-end car, official-looking papers, probably has a lawyer boyfriend feeding her lines." Delane nodded. "Just make sure your report is airtight." Behind them, Owen Ridley cleared his throat. Nervous energy translating into sound. The only protest his body could produce while his training and his rank and his 7 months of seniority kept his mouth shut. His dash camera was still recording. Had recorded everything. Every word, every movement, every decision that would later be measured against the standard of reasonable conduct and found catastrophically wanting. Corinne saw him in the side mirror, noticed his body language, the distance he maintained from the other two, the way his hand moved from his belt to his side and back, the restless shifting of someone whose conscience was louder than his courage. She filed that away too. If you're watching this and your gut is already telling you something's very wrong, trust that feeling. Like and subscribe, because what happens at that station is going to make this highway look like a warm-up. The convoy moved south on I-85. 3 vehicles, light cycling, no sirens. Hadley's patrol car in front with Corinne behind the partition, Delane following. Ridley bringing up the rear, silent, witnessing. His camera capturing the procession from the third-person perspective that would later become the prosecution's most valuable exhibit. The precinct was 15 minutes away. Corinne rode in silence. The vinyl seat squeaked when the car took turns. The partition vibrated with road noise. Her fingers had gone numb below the cuffs. Circulation restricted, tingling giving way to absence, the body quietly shutting down what it couldn't supply. She did not ask for the cuffs to be loosened, did not request a bathroom, did not demand her rights. Every unspoken word was a tactical choice, because everything she said would end up in a report, and she knew how reports worked. She knew how officers shaped language to match narratives. She knew the difference between what happened and what was documented, because she'd spent years reading the gap between those two things and finding justice, or its absence, in the space between. She closed her eyes. Not sleeping. Running scenarios. If they booked her, she'd be fingerprinted, photographed, processed through a system that treated every input the same regardless of what came in. She'd get her phone call. She'd make one call. Not to a lawyer, not to a bail bondsman, to Julian. And she would tell him exactly what to do, and more importantly, what not to do. Because the real confrontation wasn't happening tonight. Tonight was evidence collection. Every violation they committed was a brick in a wall she would build later, in a room where she held the authority and they held nothing. Tonight, she was the raw material of a case. Tomorrow, she would be something else entirely. The Mecklenburg County precinct sat on a block of municipal concrete that looked exactly like what it was: institutional, functional, designed to process human beings with the same efficiency a plant processes cattle. Loading dock in the rear, fluorescent lights that never turned off. The smell of burnt coffee and old paper seeping through ventilation ducts that hadn't been cleaned since the building opened in 1997. Hadley pulled into the Sallyport. Engine off. He stepped out, opened the rear door, and reached in to pull Corinne out by the upper arm. His grip was too high, fingers digging into the soft tissue above her elbow, compressing the nerve that ran beneath the bicep. She stumbled on the transition from car to concrete, her balance compromised by the cuffed hands and the numbness in her wrists. Her left knee hit the ground, a sharp crack of bone on pavement that echoed in the enclosed space. She didn't fall, caught herself on the knee, absorbed the impact, stood back up in one motion. But the scrape was there. She could feel it through her pants, the sting of abraded skin, another piece of physical evidence added to the inventory of the night. Hadley didn't acknowledge the stumble, didn't slow down, just kept walking, pulling her forward by the arm, through the Sallyport door, into the hallway that smelled like every precinct hallway in every city she'd ever visited, known, worked in. The word she almost thought was too specific, so she let it pass unformed. Inside, Lieutenant Vernon Greaves sat at the booking desk. 49 years old, watch commander for the night shift, a man who'd found his level and built a fortress around it. He was processing paperwork when they entered, pen in one hand, coffee in the other, the multitasking posture of someone who'd signed so many forms that his signature had devolved into a single illegible stroke. "You ran her through the system?" Greaves asked without looking up. "Clean record," Hadley said, "but the vehicle profile fits the pattern we've been seeing. Luxury car, late night, black woman." He said the last two words without hesitation, without filter, without awareness that what he'd just done was speak the quiet part out loud, the operational logic that drove the stop, the pursuit, the arrest, the entire architecture of an interaction built on a single assumption that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the color of skin. Greaves signed the booking form, didn't read it, didn't review the arrest narrative, didn't ask about probable cause or dispatch confirmation, or why the registration had been thrown on the ground instead of reviewed. Just signed, one stroke, illegible, and slid the form back across the desk. Book her. Process. Let day shift sort it out. One signature, 6 words, and the system swallowed another person whole. Delane arrived 4 minutes later, brushing gravel dust from her jacket, carrying Corinne's business cards in a plastic evidence bag like they were contraband. She dropped the bag on Greaves's desk with a flat clap. "False impersonation evidence," she said. "Official-looking credentials. Seal, embossing, the whole package. Add it to the charges." Greaves picked up the bag, held it under the desk lamp. Read the card through the plastic. His eyebrows moved, a fraction of a millimeter upward, the involuntary twitch of a man who'd just read something that didn't fit. He set the bag down quickly. Too quickly. "Noted," he said, and wrote nothing in the remarks column. Corinne watched this exchange from the processing bench 6 feet away. She watched Greaves read the card. She watched his eyebrows move. She watched him set it down and choose, in that moment, not to make the phone call that the card's contents demanded, not to verify, not to check, not to do the one thing that would have unraveled the entire charade in under 60 seconds. He chose, and that choice would follow him. Hadley leaned against the corridor wall, arms crossed, watching the booking process with the satisfied posture of a man supervising his own handiwork. He caught Corinne's eyes, held them. "Still think this is a mistake?" The smile hadn't left since the highway. Mistakes get sorted at arraignment, You'll get a public defender. They'll explain how this works." She held his gaze, said nothing. The silence was louder than any response. A silence that contained no fear, no plea, no performance. Just the quiet patience of someone keeping score. It unnerved him. He could feel it. The absence of the reaction he expected, the begging or the threats or the desperate invocation of names and connections. She just sat there, still, watching, like she was the one conducting an evaluation and he was the one being assessed. He pushed off the wall and walked away. The smile faded as he turned the corner. The booking process took 47 minutes. Corinne was photographed. Front and right profile. The camera flash hot and sudden, the digital shutter clicking like a judgment. The booking officer positioned her with his hands on her shoulders, pressing down harder than necessary, forcing her to straighten against the height chart. She stood 5'7". The flash fired twice. 2 images for the system. 2 more documents that would outlive the charges by years. She was fingerprinted. The officer handling the ink pad pressed her fingers down harder than necessary, bending her index and middle fingers backward at the first knuckle, the pressure grinding bone against the glass surface. She winced. He didn't notice or didn't care. When he finished, he tossed a single paper towel onto the counter, not toward her, onto the counter, and walked away without offering the alcohol wipe that regulations required for removing residual ink. She cleaned the ink off with the paper towel, slowly, thoroughly. The black stain smeared but didn't fully come off. Her fingertips stayed darkened, carrying the chemical residue of the system's touch. Her belongings were inventoried and sealed in a manila envelope. Phone, dead battery, wallet, 3 credit cards, driver's license already in Hadley's possession. Keys, Mercedes fob and 2 others. A pen, blue ink, the one she'd been using to annotate case files 6 hours earlier. The leather briefcase was tagged separately, its contents listed as miscellaneous documents and business cards. Miscellaneous. The word covered a multitude of specifics that no one had bothered to examine, including a case file that bore the name of the arresting officer, in a folder marked with a red tab, inside a briefcase that belonged to the person who would determine his future. Corinne watched her possessions disappear into the envelope, watched the officer seal it with red evidence tape, watched her phone, her connection to Julian, to the outside, to the apparatus of accountability she could have activated with a single call to the right number, vanish into a wire basket behind the desk. She said nothing. They allowed her 1 phone call. Standard procedure, the right guaranteed under North Carolina general statutes, the one piece of the process they followed correctly, perhaps out of habit rather than respect. The wall phone in the corridor was mounted at shoulder height. The receiver was greasy. An officer stood 6 feet away, close enough to overhear, far enough to claim he wasn't listening. Julian answered on the second ring. Julian Bellamy, corporate attorney, a man who understood contracts and clauses and the precise architecture of language designed to bind or release. But he also understood something else. The sound of his wife's voice when she was operating in a mode that civilians never saw. The mode she'd developed across a career that required composure under circumstances that would break most people and had, in fact, broken several she'd known personally. Julian, her voice was low, controlled, every word chosen. Listen carefully. Don't say anything. Don't come to the station. Don't call anyone. Not Derek. Not Claudia. Nobody. Meet me at the courthouse tomorrow at 8:30. Main entrance. I'll explain everything then. Silence on the other end. She could hear him breathing, the slightly faster rhythm of a man processing information that didn't make sense, whose instincts were screaming at him to act, and whose wife was telling him to wait. Are you safe? 2 words, the only ones that mattered. I will be. I love you. She hung up, returned to the booking area. The officer escorted her to the holding cell, a concrete box at the end of a corridor that smelled like bleach and regret. Metal bench bolted to the wall. Stainless steel toilet in the corner, lidless, exposed. Fluorescent tube overhead, buzzing at a frequency designed to prevent sleep. One other occupant, a woman, mid-40s, asleep on the bench, snoring in the thick rhythms of alcohol sedation. Disorderly conduct, probably. The night's other catch. Corinne sat on the opposite end of the bench, back straight. Coat pulled around her, the torn sleeve hanging loose, the lining visible, a record of the night written in damaged fabric. She crossed her ankles, rested her cuffed hands. They'd moved them to the front for the cell, small mercy, on her lap, and she closed her eyes. Not to sleep, to plan. The fluorescent light buzzed. The other woman snored. The toilet dripped. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed. Metal on metal, the sound of a system operating as designed, processing bodies and paperwork with the same indifference. In her mind, Corinne was not in a cell. She was 3 moves ahead, in a room she knew intimately, performing a function she'd trained for, surrounded by people who would listen to her not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. She'd been underestimated before, many times, by people with more power and less imagination than the man who'd just thrown her registration on the ground. Every single one of them had learned the same lesson. She intended to teach it again. At 1:14 a.m., boots in the corridor, not the shuffling gait of the desk sergeant making rounds, purposeful, approaching. Corinne opened her eyes. A face appeared at the cell door's narrow window. Male, mid-40s, a lieutenant's bars on the collar. Not Greaves, someone else. He studied her through the glass the way a buyer studies merchandise, assessing value and risk simultaneously. "This the one from the highway?" he asked over his shoulder. A voice from down the corridor. The booking officer. "That's her. Hadley's arrest. Stolen vehicle plus false impersonation." The lieutenant stared at Corinne for another 5 seconds. She stared back. Didn't blink. Didn't speak. Just held his gaze with the patience of someone who understood that eye contact was a negotiation, and the first person to look away had already conceded. He looked away. "Make sure Hadley's report is clean before end of shift," he said to nobody in particular. Then the boots retreated down the corridor, and the fluorescent buzz reclaimed the silence. Corinne noted 2 things. First, the lieutenant had come specifically to look at her, not to review the arrest, not to verify charges, but to see the person. Second, make sure the report is clean was not a quality control instruction. It was a directive to align the paperwork with the arrest, not the arrest with the facts. The system was already circling its wagons, and the arrest was less than 2 hours old. She pressed her thumb against her opposite wrist, testing the damage beneath the cuff marks. The skin was hot, swollen, the tissue underneath already darkening. By morning the bruises would be visible, 2 bracelets of purple and black ringing her wrists like evidence tags, physical documentation that no report could rewrite and no records clerk could expunge. The other woman on the bench stirred, muttered something about a parking meter, rolled over and resumed snoring. The toilet dripped. The fluorescent tube flickered once, a brief death and resurrection that made the shadows jump, then steadied. At 2:47 a.m., 3 floors below the holding cells, the Records Division server room hummed in institutional darkness. A single terminal glowed blue-white. The access log would later show Terminal WH-Records-03. User B. Prewitt. Login 2:47 a.m. Duration 14 minutes. Boyd. Prewitt was 36 years old, Records Division, the kind of civil servant who'd found the seam between bureaucracy and power and lived inside it. He wasn't a cop, didn't carry a badge, didn't need one. What he carried was access, system administrator credentials that let him open, modify, archive, and expunge files that other people needed warrants to see. He'd received a phone call at 2:15 a.m., not on his department phone, on the prepaid cell he kept in the glove compartment of his Nissan for conversations that didn't need to exist in any official record. The call lasted 90 seconds. He didn't save the number afterward. Now he sat at the terminal, navigating through Hadley's personnel file with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. 4 prior complaints: excessive force, racial profiling, falsified reports, sat in the active queue, each one a liability, each one a thread that could be pulled until the whole garment unraveled. He highlighted all 4, selected expunge, confirmed. The system prompted for a reason code. He typed, administrative review, records reconciliation, routine maintenance. Routine. The word that covered everything and explained nothing. The complaints vanished from Hadley's file, not deleted, the server architecture didn't allow true deletion, but moved to a partition that required supervisory authorization to access, buried under 3 layers of administrative clearance, effectively invisible to anyone running a standard personnel review. Then Prewitt did something else. He opened the dashcam server, the repository where patrol footage was uploaded and stored for mandatory 90-day retention. He navigated to Ridley's upload, 47 minutes of continuous footage, time-stamped, geotagged, uncompressed. He didn't delete it. Deleting triggered an automatic audit flag. Instead, he selected a 12-minute segment, minutes 23 through 35, the window that captured Hadley searching the briefcase, finding the credentials, and Delane ordering the false impersonation charge, and applied a data corruption filter, a tool designed for recovering damaged files, repurposed for creating damage. The segment scrambled, its visual data rendered unreadable, its audio reduced to digital static. 12 minutes. Surgical. Plausible. The kind of corruption that IT departments saw regularly enough to shrug at. Prewitt logged out. The terminal went dark. He left through the basement exit, avoiding the main corridors and their cameras. 14 minutes. 4 complaints expunged. 12 minutes of footage corrupted. 1 phone call with no record. And no one would notice for hours. Maybe longer. Maybe never, if the case followed the usual trajectory. Charges dropped, suspect released, file closed, institutional memory reset to 0. But Prewitt didn't know about the audio backup on Hadley's body camera. And he didn't know that Ridley had watched the full footage before uploading, that the images he'd just corrupted already existed in a human memory that couldn't be accessed through a terminal or erased with a filter. Some evidence lived on servers. Some lived in the minds of people who'd seen what they'd seen and couldn't unsee it. In the holding cell, Corinne didn't know about Prewitt, didn't know about the expunged complaints or the midnight phone call, or the 14 minutes of digital surgery that had just altered the evidentiary landscape she'd walk into tomorrow. But she knew the pattern, had seen it too many times. The way institutions closed ranks around their own, the way paperwork rearranged itself to match preferred narratives, the way the gap between what happened and what was documented grew wider every time someone decided that accountability was more expensive than complicity. She sat on the metal bench, coat torn, wrists bruised, dignity intact, and she waited for morning. At his desk in the patrol room, Trent Hadley typed his arrest report with the confidence of a man who believed the story and the truth were the same thing because he'd written both. Suspect vehicle. Mercedes E-Class, high value, luxury model inconsistent with registered address demographics. He typed, inconsistent with registered address demographics, without realizing he'd just documented his own bias in language clear enough to be read aloud in a courtroom. Dilworth was one of Charlotte's most affluent neighborhoods. The car was entirely consistent with the address, but Hadley's version of consistency required the driver to match a picture in his head, and Corinne Bellamy did not match that picture. Suspect behavior: nervous, evasive responses, reluctance to provide identification. Nervous. She was still. Evasive. She answered every question directly. Reluctant. She'd had her documents prepared before he reached the window. The report described a woman who didn't exist, a fiction built to justify an arrest that shouldn't have happened. He uploaded his body camera footage to the department server. In the upload notes, he typed, "Video equipment malfunctioned during stop. Audio only available." The video hadn't malfunctioned. He'd turned it off. A deliberate action, thumb on the button, 3-second hold, the tiny click that killed the visual feed. He'd done it before. Multiple times. standard practice among officers who understood that cameras were accountability devices, and accountability was the enemy of discretion. But the audio kept running. He didn't know this. The body camera's audio system operated on a separate circuit, a redundancy feature installed after a department-wide review of equipment failures 2 years earlier. When the video feed was manually disabled, the audio continued recording on a backup channel, a fact buried in page 47 of the equipment manual that Hadley had never read because page 47 was 46 pages past his attention span. So his voice was captured. Every word, every dismissive laugh, every assumption spoken aloud in the comfortable privacy of what he believed was an unmonitored interaction. People like you always think you can drive cars like this. Captured. I know exactly what I'm looking at. Captured. The laugh. The crumpled registration. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting on skin. All of it. All. Preserved in digital amber, waiting to be discovered by someone who knew what to listen for. Hadley logged out of his terminal, gathered his jacket, walked to the parking lot, got in his truck, drove home to a 3-bedroom ranch in a suburb where the lawns were cut weekly, and the neighbors waved from their porches, and nobody asked questions about what happened during the night shift, because nobody wanted to know. He showered, set his alarm for 7:30, climbed into bed, and he slept well, because in his mind, the case was closed. Another arrest, another report, another black woman in an expensive car who'd been processed and documented and funneled through the system. The paperwork was filed. The narrative was sealed. Day shift would sort it out, drop the charges, move on. No harm done. Except tomorrow morning, he had court. The Hadley trial. His trial. The excessive force case. The one involving the 16-year-old named Jalen Odom, whose back still ached on cold mornings from a knee pressed into his spine on a sidewalk 7 months ago. He'd show up in his dress uniform. His lawyer would handle the rest. The case was manageable, defensible. The kid had been resisting. The force had been necessary. The report supported the narrative. Everything was under control. He fell asleep at 12:17 a.m., and his breathing was slow and even and untroubled. The breathing of a man who believed he'd done nothing wrong because he'd never been told otherwise by anyone whose opinion he valued. 3 floors below the patrol room, in the records division server, a file named Hadley_bodycam_102.924.wav sat in a queue, waiting to be reviewed. It would wait 4 more hours. Then it would end everything. Jing. 2:14 a.m. The precinct locker room was empty except for Owen Ridley and the sound of his own breathing. He sat on the bench in front of his locker, still in uniform, boots untied, staring at the personal tablet propped against his duffel bag. Department policy allowed officers to review their own dash camera footage for report-writing purposes. Standard procedure. Routine. He'd watched the footage 3 times. The first time, he told himself he was looking for details to include in his supplemental report. The second time, he stopped pretending. The third time, he just sat there and let the images wash through him. The Mercedes pulling over, the spotlight activation, Hadley approaching with his flashlight high and his body language already escalated, already aggressive, already decided. The timestamp was the thing that kept pulling him back. He'd rewound to the same moment 4 times now, watching the numbers in the corner of the frame. 23:48:11. Hadley spins Corinne Bellamy around and places her in handcuffs. 23:51:03. Dispatch confirms the vehicle is registered. The record is clean. No stolen vehicle report exists. 3 minutes. Hadley had arrested her 3 minutes before the system told him there was no reason to arrest her. And after dispatch confirmed, Hadley hadn't removed the cuffs, hadn't reconsidered, hadn't even paused. Ridley knew what that meant, not in the abstract legal sense, he'd learn that language later, but in the operational sense, the practical sense, the sense that came from 7 months of academy training where they'd drilled one principle above all others. Probable cause isn't a feeling. It's a standard, and the standard requires facts, not assumptions. Hadley hadn't had facts. He'd had a profile: luxury car, late night, black woman. The profile wasn't in any manual, wasn't in any training module. It lived in the space between what officers were taught and what officers practiced, transmitted not through policy, but through culture, through the nods and glances and coded phrases that senior officers used to teach rookies, which people deserved scrutiny and which ones didn't. Ridley closed the footage, opened it again, closed it. His father's voice surfaced, the way it always did when he stood at a crossroads and couldn't see the path clearly. His father, Maurice Ridley, Jamaican immigrant, electrician, 22 years in Charlotte, a man who'd wired half the new construction in University City and never once been late on a payment or short on a handshake. You became a cop so people who looked like your mother would feel safe calling one. His mother, Denise Ridley née Campbell, dark-skinned, Trinidadian, worked registration at Atrium Health for 19 years. The kind of woman who called everyone baby and held doors for strangers and drove a 10-year-old Honda Accord that she kept spotless because she believed the car you drove told people who you were. If his mother drove a Mercedes, and if his mother were pulled over on I-85 at midnight, and if the officer crumpled her registration without reading it, what would he want the rookie standing 15 feet away to do? Ridley knew the answer. Had known it since the moment he watched Hadley slam Corinne into the car door and heard the fabric of her coat tear on the handle. He uploaded the dashcam footage to the department server at 2:51 a.m. full file, unedited. 47 minutes of continuous recording, including audio. Then he sat in the locker room for another 20 minutes, staring at the empty row of lockers across from him, thinking about what he'd done and what he hadn't done, and whether the difference between the two would be enough to matter when this was over. 6 a.m. A different desk sergeant, day shift, bored, half awake, unaware of context or consequence. Charges pending DA review. You're free to go. Sign here for your property. Corinne signed, took the manila envelope, opened it. Phone, still dead. Wallet, keys, pen. The briefcase was returned separately, its contents undisturbed except for the disorder left by Hadley's search. The business cards had been shuffled. The case files were out of sequence. The red-tabbed folder, State versus Hadley, had been opened but not apparently read. She walked out of the precinct. Morning air cold on her face, the kind of October cold that carried the smell of damp asphalt and dying leaves. The parking lot stretched ahead of her, chain-link fence around the perimeter, her Mercedes sitting in the impound section because they'd processed it, but found no reason to hold it because there was no theft, because the car was hers. She got in, turned the key. The engine caught immediately, the familiar hum of German engineering, unchanged, indifferent to what had happened to its driver. Then she saw the door handle, scratches, 3 parallel lines gouged into the chrome, from the handcuffs, from the moment Hadley had slammed her sideways into the door. The force had dragged the steel cuffs across the handle, cutting through the finish to the bare metal underneath. Permanent damage, physical evidence of excessive force, written on the body of the car, the way bruises were written on the body underneath the coat. She noted it, didn't react, just filed it in the same place she'd filed everything else from the last 7 hours, the place where evidence was stored, sorted, and preserved until it could be deployed. The drive home was 24 minutes. I-85 north, the same stretch of highway, the same lane markings, the same mile markers passing in reverse. She drove at exactly 67 miles per hour. Hands at 10 and 2. Mirrors checked every 30 seconds. Home was a 2-story colonial in Dilworth, white siding, black shutters, the kind of house that looked like it had opinions about property values. Julian's car was in the driveway. He hadn't slept, she could tell by the lights. Kitchen light on, living room light off, bedroom light off. He'd been in the kitchen all night, which meant coffee, which meant pacing, which meant he'd been doing what lawyers do when they don't have enough information, constructing scenarios and dismantling them, one after another, until anxiety ate through the foundations and left nothing standing. He opened the front door before she reached the porch. Relief first, flooding his face like water breaking through a dam. Then anger, sharp and hot and immediately suppressed because he could see her face, and her face said, "Not now." Then confusion, because his wife was standing on their porch at 6:20 in the morning, wearing a torn coat and carrying a briefcase, and looking like she hadn't slept, but also like sleeping was the last thing she intended to do. "Corinne, what happened? You sounded—" "Not now." She walked past him into the house. Her voice was steady but thin, the kind of thin that came from holding something in place for 7 hours and feeling the first hairline cracks appear in the containment. "I need to shower. I need to change. Then I'll explain." She went upstairs. The bathroom door closed. The lock turned. Water started, hot as the handle allowed. Steam curled under the door within minutes. Inside the shower, standing under water that turned her skin red, Corinne let 7 hours of controlled composure loosen by exactly 1 degree. Not collapse, not breakdown, just a controlled release, the way a pressure valve vents steam to prevent an explosion, not because the system is failing, but because the system is designed to release before it ruptures. She stood under the water for 11 minutes, washed her hair, scrubbed her wrists where the cuffs had left angry red lines that would darken to purple by evening, washed the smell of the holding cell out of her skin. Concrete dust, industrial cleaner, the metallic scent of the bench, the sour undertone of another person's fear soaked into the same air she'd been breathing. She dried off, opened the closet. Her hand moved past casual clothes, past weekend wear, past the everyday armor of a professional woman navigating spaces that weren't designed for her. Her hand stopped on the garment bag at the far end. She unzipped it. Inside, black fabric. Heavy, structured, authoritative. The kind of garment that transformed whoever wore it, not into someone different, but into the fullest, most concentrated version of who they already were. She laid it on the bed, looked at it, felt its weight with her eyes. This was armor. Not metaphor. Function. In 3 hours, she would put this on. And the man who'd thrown her registration on the ground would learn what it meant to be wrong about the most consequential thing he'd ever been wrong about. She dressed, each button fastened with the precision of ritual, each layer adding back what the night had stripped away. Authority, position, the specific gravity of a woman who occupied space that others had to stand up for when she entered a room. Downstairs, kitchen. Julian had 2 cups of coffee on the counter. He stood by the window, tie loosened, the posture of a man who'd been standing in the same spot for hours and had forgotten to sit down. She poured coffee, took a sip, set the cup down, looked at him. "Last night, Officer Trent Hadley pulled me over on I-85 at mile marker 58. He arrested me for operating a stolen vehicle. Dispatch confirmed the car was mine before he put me in cuffs. He arrested me anyway. Then they added false impersonation of a public official." Julian's face moved through stages, disbelief cracking into rage, cracking into the cold clarity of a man who prosecuted contracts for a living and understood exactly how many laws had just been broken. "We sue. Federal civil rights violation. 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. I'll have papers filed by—" "No." The word landed like a gavel. "Not yet. Meet me at the courthouse at 8:30, main entrance. You'll understand then." He studied her face. He knew that face. He'd been married to it for 14 years, had seen it across dinner tables and in delivery rooms, and at funerals, and in the quiet moments before she walked into rooms where her presence determined outcomes. This was the face she wore when the plan was already complete, and all that remained was execution. "What are you planning?" She picked up her briefcase. The same briefcase Hadley had thrown on the hood of a patrol car and rifled through like it was contraband. It still contained the same files, including the one with his name on the tab. "Justice," she said. "Meet me at 8:30. She kissed his cheek, walked to the door. But she didn't leave immediately. She set the briefcase on the hallway table, opened it, and pulled out the case file. the red-tabbed folder. State versus Hadley. She'd read it 3 times yesterday afternoon. She'd read it a 4th time now, standing in her own foyer at 6:45 in the morning, wearing the garment that defined her public identity, reading the words with eyes that had changed since the last review. Excessive force allegations. A 16-year-old boy named Jalen Odom. Traffic stop on a residential street in Westinghouse. Hadley's knee on the boy's back for 43 seconds, documented by a neighbor's cell phone video. Disproportionate response to what the report called furtive movements, and what the video showed was a teenager reaching for a wallet. Corinne had reviewed the medical photographs twice yesterday. Now she looked at them a 3rd time and saw something she hadn't seen before. Not in the images themselves, but in the pattern they described. The bruising on Jalen's back, the abrasions on his forearms, the angle of the knee impression visible in the contusion map. It matched. The same escalation pattern, the same physical mechanics, the same overwhelming force applied to a compliant subject who posed no threat. She had felt it last night, the spin, the slam, the arm wrenched behind her back. Now she was reading about it in clinical language, in a case file prepared for a trial she was scheduled to oversee, committed by the same officer who'd committed it against her. She wasn't just the person who would hear this case anymore. She was evidence. Exhibit A, in a pattern that connected the boy on the sidewalk to the woman on the highway, and the thread running between them, was a man who'd decided that people who looked a certain way deserved a certain kind of treatment, regardless of what they'd done or hadn't done. She closed the file, placed it back in the briefcase, snapped the clasp. Something in the way she moved, the set of her shoulders, the angle of her chin, the weight of what she now carried internally as well as in her hands, made Julian understand that he was not watching his wife leave for work. He was watching someone prepare for war. Corinne drove to the courthouse, parked in the reserved section, a spot marked with a small sign that she walked past without glancing at. She entered through the side entrance, avoided the main lobby, didn't want to explain the dark circles under her eyes or the bandage-width bruises on her wrists that her sleeves mostly covered, but not entirely. She walked down a corridor she knew by count, 37 steps from the side door to the private stairwell, 14 steps up, 9 steps to the door with her name on it. She locked the door behind her, sat at her desk, set the briefcase down, and for 30 seconds, only 30, she pressed her palms flat against the wood surface and let her hands shake. They'd been steady all night. Through the stop, the cuffs, the booking, the cell, the release. 14 hours of absolute control, and now, in the privacy of a room where no one could see and no one would know, she allowed herself the physical truth. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the accumulated weight of rage held in check for so long that the muscles had forgotten how to release it gradually. 30 seconds. Then she pressed her palms harder. The shaking stopped. She opened the case file one more time, read the first page, then the second. Her phone buzzed. Text from the bailiff. Courtroom ready. Parties arriving. She stood, smoothed the garment she wore, checked her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. Composed, professional, no visible sign of the night except the faint shadows under her eyes that could be attributed to early mornings rather than holding cells. She picked up her gavel, felt its weight. Solid oak, brass-banded, the kind of object that existed to convert authority into sound. In 12 minutes, Trent Hadley would walk through the courtroom doors. He would be looking down at his notes, talking to his lawyer, not paying attention to the bench. Then the side door would open, 3 steps up, and he would look up, and everything he thought he knew about last night would collapse. 7:12 a.m. 7. Internal Affairs Division, 3rd floor, East Wing. Detective Frankie Lau had been awake for 26 hours, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the footage playing on her monitor, uploaded at 2:51 a.m. by a rookie named Ridley, whose supplemental report consisted of a single line. Dash cam footage, October 29, 2024, I-85 traffic stop, Officer Hadley Primary. Please review. Please review. 2 words that in Lau's 14 years of investigating officers had never preceded good news. She watched the footage from the beginning. The Mercedes pulling over. The spotlight activation. Hadley approaching. And Lau, who had reviewed hundreds of traffic stop recordings and could read body language the way linguists read text, saw the escalation before the first word was spoken. His walk was wrong. Too fast, too squared, shoulders forward rather than neutral. This was not an officer approaching an unknown situation with appropriate caution. This was a man walking toward a conclusion he'd already reached. The footage continued. Corinne presenting documents. Hadley ignoring them. The registration thrown on the ground. Lau rewound that section twice, confirming what she saw. A valid government document, discarded without examination. The act itself a violation of Department Policy Section 6.12 regarding document handling during traffic stops. Then the physical contact. The spin. The slam against the car door. The coat tearing. The handcuffs. And Lau watched the timestamp, because timestamps were where cases lived and died. 23:48:11. Cuffs applied. 23:51:03. Dispatch confirms clean record. 3 minutes. Lau wrote the number on a legal pad, circled it, and underlined it twice. 3 minutes was an eternity in law enforcement. 3 minutes was the difference between a lawful arrest and a constitutional violation. 3 minutes was the gap between probable cause and fabrication, and no amount of report writing could bridge it because the numbers were the numbers and the numbers didn't lie. She switched to the audio. Ridley's dash cam had picked up ambient sound from 15 feet away. Not perfect quality, but clear enough. Hadley's voice. "This car doesn't belong to you." Corinne's response. "The registration is valid. You're holding my license." Delane arriving, approving the by-the-book exchange that Lau recognized immediately for what it was because she'd heard it in 24 prior investigations, and it always preceded misconduct. Then she checked the body camera server. Hadley's upload, the notation, video equipment malfunction, audio only available. Lau had seen this notation before, 17 times in the last 3 years, from officers across 5 divisions. Malfunction was the most popular lie in the department's vocabulary, the technical excuse that covered deliberate deactivation the way "I feared for my safety" covered unjustified force. She pulled the audio, hit play, and there it was. Hadley's voice, captured on the backup audio channel he didn't know existed, speaking with the relaxed candor of a man who believed no one was listening. "People like you always think you can drive cars like this. I know exactly what I'm looking at." Lau stopped the recording, rewound, played it again, wrote down the words exactly as spoken, longhand, on the legal pad. Then she continued. Corinne's voice. "Officer, this is my vehicle. The registration is valid. You can verify through dispatch." Hadley laughing. "Sure you are. And I'm the governor." Delane. "Process her fully. Document everything." Hadley again. "She matches the profile perfectly. Expensive car, late night, black woman. We both know how this works." Lau stopped the recording a second time, set down her pen, leaned back in her chair. In 14 years, she'd investigated 73 officers. She'd seen patterns emerge and dissolve. She'd seen cover-ups so elaborate they required flowcharts and cover-ups so clumsy they required only a single phone call to unravel. She'd seen the system protect its own with a ferocity that made her question, on her worst days, whether internal affairs existed to ensure accountability or merely to simulate it. But this one was different. She pulled Hadley's personnel file, opened the complaint history. 4 formal complaints in the past 2 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, falsification of reports. She scrolled to the status column. All 4, expunged. Date of expungement, October 8, 2024, 3 weeks ago. Authorized by Boyd Pruitt, Records Division. No review committee hearing documented. No supervisory sign-off. No notation in the case management system explaining why 4 active complaints had been erased from an officer's record 3 weeks before his trial date. Lau opened her email, composed a message. To Captain Dwight Osborne. From Detective F. Lau, Internal Affairs Division. Date, October 30th, 2024, 7:12 a.m. Subject, urgent. Incident involving Officer Hadley, Case Y AD-2024-0847. Captain, evidence of serious misconduct, traffic stop last night. Video and audio documentation secured from Officer Ridley's dash cam and Hadley's body cam audio backup. Timestamp discrepancy confirms arrest prior to dispatch clearance. Recorded statements include explicit racial bias language. Additionally, 4 prior complaints against Hadley were expunged from his personnel file on October 8th by Boyd Pruitt, Records Division, without review committee process. Possible obstruction. Recommend your immediate presence in courtroom this morning. One more thing, Captain, and I need you to hear this clearly. The woman Officer Hadley arrested last night is Corinne Bellamy. She sent the email. Then she picked up her desk phone and dialed Osborne's direct line. He answered on the 3rd ring. The voice of a man who was already drinking coffee and reading reports and hadn't yet been told that his morning was about to become the worst of his career. Captain, it's Lau. Did you get my email? Just opened it. How bad are we talking? Career-ending bad, possibly criminal charges. Multiple officers involved, Hadley, Delane, Greaves. She paused. Let the silence carry weight. And Captain, the victim, Corinne Bellamy. She's the presiding authority in the Hadley trial scheduled for 9 a.m. this morning. His excessive force case, the Jalen Odom matter. Silence. 5 full seconds. Lau could hear Osborne's coffee cup settle on his desk, the ceramic click of a man whose hand had stopped working. Say that again. Hadley arrested the person who's scheduled to determine the outcome of his own trial, 10 hours before it starts, on fabricated charges, with audio of him making racially biased statements, and his complaint history was scrubbed 3 weeks ago by someone in records who didn't follow procedure. Another silence. Longer this time. When Osborne spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower, flatter, the register of a man who'd stopped being a morning commuter and started being a commanding officer assessing institutional damage. I'll be there. Don't tip him off. I want to see his face when he walks in. I want to see if he knows. He doesn't know, Captain. He has no idea what's waiting for him. Good. We need his reaction on record. Consciousness of guilt. Already planned for it. Osborne hung up. Lau set down the phone, opened her case management system, created a new file. IAD-2024-0847. Priority, urgent. Classification, confidential. She began documenting. Timestamps, screenshots, chain of custody for the dash cam footage, download log for the audio. The architecture of accountability, built one data point at a time, the way she'd built every case for 14 years, brick by brick, fact by fact, until the wall was too high and too solid for anyone to climb over or tear down. In 3 hours, Hadley would walk into that courtroom. Confident, prepared, wearing his dress uniform with the shoes polished and the collar straight, believing he was defending himself against one excessive force complaint filed by one teenager whose word wouldn't hold up against an officer's training record and a lawyer's cross-examination strategy. He had no idea that internal affairs was activated, that his captain would be in the gallery, that every action from last night was now evidence, that the audio he thought he'd killed was alive and devastating and already climbing the chain of command. He had no idea what was waiting. Stay with this story, because what Trent Hadley is about to walk into will be the most devastating 30 seconds of his entire life. And it starts right now. 8:27 a.m., suburban Charlotte. Trent Hadley stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his dress uniform, the one reserved for court appearances, pressed the night before by a dry cleaner who charged $11 and never asked questions. Shoes polished to parade standard, belt buckle centered. Every crease aligned with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was argument, that looking professional was half the battle in a courtroom where juries made decisions based on impressions they'd never admit to forming. His phone buzzed. Text message from Darren Spaulding, criminal defense attorney, ex-public defender, the kind of lawyer who'd handled enough police cases to know where the landmines were buried and which paths to walk around them. The text read, "Judge hasn't changed. Stick to the script. She's known for being fair, but thorough. Professional tone only. Don't volunteer anything." Hadley typed back, one-handed, while reaching for his keys. "No problem. Had a weird stop last night, though. Woman claimed to be some kind of official. Can you believe it? Had the credentials and everything. Professional job." He hit send, checked his teeth in the mirror, straightened his tie one more time, walked to the front door. His phone buzzed again. Spaulding. What was her name? Hadley typed while walking to his truck. Bellamy. Corinne Bellamy. Whole briefcase full of documents. Impressive, honestly. He tossed the phone on the passenger seat, started the engine, backed out of the driveway. Didn't see Spaulding's response because Spaulding didn't respond. Not with words, not with a text, not with anything that could be transmitted through a phone. What Spaulding did was stop moving. He was standing in his office on the 4th floor of a building on South Tryon Street, briefcase in one hand, case file in the other, halfway between his desk and the door. And he stopped. The way a man stops when he walks into a glass wall he didn't see. Full body arrest, momentum killed by impact. Because he knew that name. Corinne Bellamy. He'd appeared before her twice in the past 14 months. Both cases. Police defendants. Both outcomes. Professional, measured, fair, and merciless toward procedural violations. She'd sanctioned a detective in the first case for incomplete discovery. She'd denied a motion to suppress in the second, then used the ruling to lecture the defense, calmly, precisely, without raising her voice, on the difference between legal technicality and substantive justice. She was not someone you wanted to face unprepared. She was not someone you wanted to face at all, if you had anything to hide. And his client had just arrested her. Spaulding set his briefcase on the desk, sat down. The leather chair creaked under him. He opened the case file, the physical folder, the one he'd been carrying to court. State of North Carolina versus Trent Hadley. Case number 2024-CR-1147. Presiding, Honorable Corinne Bellamy. Mecklenburg County Superior Court. The words sat on the page. He read them 3 times. Each reading made them worse, because each reading added another layer of implication. The arrest, the fabricated charges, the false impersonation allegation filed against a sitting member of the bench by the defendant in her own courtroom, 10 hours before trial. He picked up his phone, thumb hovering over Hadley's contact. Should he call? Warn him? Give him time to prepare? He didn't call. Professional calculation. If he warned Hadley now, if there was a record of a call between attorney and client between the arrest and the court appearance, it might look like coordination, obstruction, consciousness of guilt by proxy. Better to assess in person. See how bad it really was. See if there was any angle, any procedural foothold, any miracle of legal architecture that could salvage what his client had just demolished. He closed his phone, stood up, gathered his files, and walked toward the courthouse, carrying a case file with a name on the cover that now meant something entirely different than it had 12 hours ago. When Trent Hadley had read that same name on a business card, held it under a flashlight, and called it a fake. The courthouse was 11 minutes away. Spaulding drove in silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the sound of his own breathing and the growing certainty that what waited in courtroom 3 was going to be unlike anything he'd ever experienced in 21 years of criminal defense. Because his client hadn't just made a mistake. His client had made the kind of mistake that destroyed departments. That launched federal investigations. That turned officers into defendants and defendants into cautionary tales. His client had arrested the one person in Charlotte who had the authority, the evidence, and the motivation to make sure this time the system didn't protect its own. And in 32 minutes, Trent Hadley was going to walk through those courtroom doors, look up at the bench, and see her. The thought hit Spaulding like ice water in the chest. He gripped the steering wheel tighter and drove faster. 8:41 a.m. Courthouse Hallway, second floor. The morning traffic of justice moved through the corridor in its usual rhythm. Attorneys checking phones, witnesses sitting on wooden benches with the hollow-eyed stare of people waiting to relive the worst moments of their lives in front of strangers, bailiffs exchanging shift notes, the low mechanical hum of a building designed to process human conflict at scale. Trent Hadley walked through the security checkpoint at 8:43. Badge and service weapon left in his vehicle. Court protocol. He wore his dress uniform the way a soldier wears parade dress. Pressed, pinned, polished, every crease a statement about discipline he didn't actually possess. He nodded to two officers in the hallway, colleagues there for other cases, other hearings. They wished him luck. He didn't think he needed it. He'd rehearsed his testimony with Spaulding twice. The story was clean. The kid had made a furtive movement. The officer had responded according to training. The force applied was proportional to the perceived threat. Standard language. Tested language. The kind of language that had survived 100 cross-examinations in 100 courtrooms and would survive this one. He sat on the bench outside courtroom 3. Checked his phone. No new messages from Spaulding, which was unusual because Spaulding always sent a final prep text 15 minutes before proceedings. Usually something clipped and tactical. Remember? Short answers. Don't elaborate. Let me redirect. Nothing. Hadley put his phone away, rolled his shoulders, cracked his knuckles, left hand, then right, the sound popping through the hallway quiet. A nervous habit he didn't recognize as nervous because he didn't believe he was nervous. He believed he was ready. At 8:48, Darren Spaulding came through the east entrance, briefcase in hand, face carefully neutral, the courtroom mask he'd developed over 21 years of defending people who'd done things they shouldn't have. But beneath the mask, behind the eyes, something was wrong, the kind of wrong that a client couldn't read, but a fellow attorney could spot from across a room. He walked to Hadley, stood over him, didn't sit. "Blake, the woman you arrested last night." Hadley looked up. "Yeah? Bellamy? What about her?" The bailiff opened the courtroom doors. The heavy oak swung inward, releasing the scent of old wood and furniture polish and the particular staleness of rooms where air circulated but never truly refreshed. All parties for State versus Hadley, courtroom 3, the Honorable. Spaulding gripped Hadley's arm. Hard. The grip of a man trying to physically anchor another man to a moment that was about to become unrecoverable. "Trent, listen to me. Whatever happens in the next 2 minutes, do not speak. Do you understand? Not one word." Hadley frowned. "What are you talking about?" But Spaulding was already walking through the doors, and the bailiff was gesturing, and the hallway was emptying, and Hadley followed, because that's what you did when your lawyer walked and the doors were open and the case was called. You followed. Courtroom 3 was mid-sized, 4 rows of gallery seating, prosecution table on the left, defense on the right. The bench, elevated, dark oak, the state seal mounted on the front panel, sat empty. The side door behind it was closed. Hadley walked down the center aisle, still looking at his notes, still reviewing the talking points Spaulding had given him last week. Short answers. Don't volunteer. Let me redirect. He was mouthing the words silently, rehearsing, when he reached the defense table and sat down. In the gallery's back row, Captain Dwight Osborne sat with his phone already recording. His face showed nothing. Beside him, Detective Frankie Lau held a sealed folder across her lap and kept her eyes on the side door. A.D. Akendra Vaughn, prosecution, 29, prepared, competent, completely unaware of the context, arranged her files at the prosecution table. She'd been assigned the Hadley case 3 months ago. Excessive force against a minor. Strong evidence. Winnable. She had no idea it was about to become something else entirely. In the front row of the gallery, a 16-year-old boy sat with his mother, Jalen Odom. Small for his age, wearing a button-down shirt that was slightly too large in the shoulders, the shirt of someone who'd been dressed by a parent who wanted the court to see a child, not a suspect. His hands rested on his knees. His back still ached when the weather changed, 7 months after an officer's knee had been pressed into his spine for 43 seconds on a Westinghouse sidewalk. The courtroom waited. Then the side door opened. 3 steps up to the bench. The sound of shoes on wood, measured, deliberate, each step carrying the weight of 14 hours that separated the woman on the highway from the woman ascending to the seat of authority. Hadley was still looking down. Spaulding was watching Hadley. The entire gallery was watching the bench. She reached the top step, stood behind the chair. Her hands rested on the surface of the bench, steady, flat, the same hands that had gripped a steering wheel at 10 and 2 while blue lights painted her mirror. Hadley looked up. Time did not stop. That's a fiction. The idea that shocking moments freeze the clock. What actually happens is that the brain processes too much information too quickly and the conscious mind falls behind, creating the illusion of slowness while the body reacts at full speed. His eyes found her face, and his brain, the same brain that had dismissed her registration, laughed at her credentials, thrown her identity on the ground like litter. His brain recognized what it was seeing and could not reconcile it with what it believed. The color left his face, not gradually, all at once, as if someone had opened a valve at the base of his skull and drained the blood downward. His skin went from ruddy to gray in under 2 seconds. His lips parted, but no sound emerged because the signal between his brain and his vocal cords had been severed by a recognition so total that it shut down everything non-essential. His briefcase hit the floor. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. Leather on wood. The metallic snap of the clasp releasing on impact. Papers spilling across the floor. Every head turned. His right hand shot forward and grabbed the edge of the defense table. Knuckles white. Fingers locked. The grip of a man holding onto the only solid object in a room that had just liquefied beneath him. His left hand went to his chest. Fingers bunching the fabric of his dress uniform over his sternum, pressing inward, as if he could physically hold his heart inside his rib cage. His knees buckled. The chair saved him. His weight dropped into it sideways, the chair legs scraping against the floor with a sound that made the bailiff step forward. The entire courtroom watched an officer in dress uniform collapse into his seat like a man who'd just been shot and hadn't yet realized it. "Sir?" The bailiff, Roy Tatum, 31 years, unflappable, moved to the defense table. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need medical assistance? I can call EMTs." Hadley shook his head. Violent, rapid, the gesture of a man who couldn't speak but could still refuse. His eyes were locked on the bench. On her. On the face he'd last seen through a flashlight beam on a gravel shoulder. The face he'd slammed into a car door. The face he'd laughed at when it told him the truth. Spaulding grabbed his elbow, leaned close. His whisper was a hiss. "Do not speak. Whatever happens next, do not open your mouth. Not one word. Do you understand me?" Hadley couldn't respond. Could only nod. Barely. If you're still watching, you already know this is about to get 100 times worse for him. Subscribe now, because what she says next will be the most devastating disclosure in courtroom history. Corinne Bellamy settled into her chair. She took her time, arranged papers on the bench. The case file she'd read 4 times now, each reading adding new weight. Straightened the brass nameplate. Adjusted her water glass 1 inch to the right. Every movement deliberate, unhurried, performed with the specific composure of a woman who understood that power was not just authority, it was tempo. She did not look at Hadley, not yet. The gallery whispered, low, urgent murmurs spreading through the rows. What's wrong with that officer? Why does he look like that? Is he having a heart attack? The whispers carried no answers because no one in the gallery, except 3 people, knew what had happened 10 hours ago on I-85. Osborne, in the back row, kept his phone recording. Lau, beside him, opened her folder and removed a single sheet, a timeline, handwritten, documenting the sequence of events from 23:43 the previous night to 07:12 this morning. Corinne looked up. Her eyes found Hadley. Locked on. 3 full seconds. Unblinking. The gaze of a woman who had spent a night in a holding cell because of the man sitting 12 feet below her and who had chosen, deliberately, strategically, to be here rather than home, rather than in a lawyer's office filing suit, rather than anywhere else in the world. He couldn't hold it. His eyes dropped to the table. Papers blurred. His hands trembled. Visible, obvious, the tremor of a man whose central nervous system had surrendered to a reality his ego could not absorb. "Counsel." Her voice was ice on marble. Formal. No emotion. "Does your client require medical assistance? We can recess for 10 minutes if needed." Spaulding stood. His hand remained on Hadley's shoulder, physically holding him in the chair, preventing the next collapse that both of them could feel building. "No, Your Honor. We're ready to proceed." A lie. Tactical. The alternative, admitting his client was having a breakdown at the sight of the judge, was worse than any lie he could construct. "Very well," Corinne's voice carried to every corner. "Good morning. Case number 2024-CR-1147, State of North Carolina versus Trent Hadley. Excessive force allegations stemming from an incident on April 18, 2024, involving a minor victim." She paused. Let the case number settle into the record. Let the silence build. "Before we begin, I need to make a disclosure to the court." The word disclosure hit Hadley like a physical blow. His head snapped up. A fresh wave of color drained from his face. Impossible, since there was nothing left to drain, but the body found new reserves of pallor. His eyes widened. His breathing turned shallow, rapid, audible from the prosecution table. Spaulding's grip tightened on his shoulder. A warning, a restraint, a D. Kendra Vaughn stood. "Ready, Your Honor." "I said I need to make a disclosure first, Counselor. Please be seated." Vaughn sat. Confused. Everyone confused. Except Hadley, Spaulding, Osborne, and Lau. They knew what was coming, and the knowing made the silence heavier. A silence with mass, with gravity, pulling every ear in the room toward the bench. Corinne's hands rested flat on the surface. Steady. No tremor. Complete control. "Last night, at approximately 11:43 p.m., I was stopped by Officer Trent Hadley on Interstate 85 at mile marker 58, Mecklenburg County. I was subsequently arrested on suspicion of operating a stolen vehicle and false impersonation of a public official. I was held in custody at the Mecklenburg County precinct until approximately 6 a.m. this morning. I was released without charges filed." The courtroom detonated. Not with sound, with its absence. A vacuum of silence so total that the fluorescent hum became audible, that the air conditioning's mechanical breath filled the room, that the creak of a gallery bench as someone leaned forward sounded like a tree falling. Then the sound returned. Gasps. Whispers escalating to murmurs escalating to voices. Vaughn's mouth opened, physically dropped, and she turned to look at Hadley, then back at Corinne, her legal mind racing through implications faster than her face could process them. The gallery erupted in ripples of shock, each row reacting a half-second after the one in front, the wave spreading backward until it hit the rear wall where Osborne sat recording everything. Jalen Odom looked at his mother. His mother looked at the judge who'd just disclosed that the defendant in her own courtroom had arrested her 10 hours ago. Hadley stared at the table. His forehead was wet. A bead of sweat ran from his hairline to his jaw and dropped onto the case file Spaulding had open in front of him, darkening the paper in a small circle. Corinne continued. Same voice, same tempo. No acceleration, no emotion bleeding through the professional mask. North Carolina Code of Judicial Conduct, Canon 3E, requires disclosure of any interaction between a presiding judge and parties appearing before the court that might create an appearance of bias or conflict of interest. I have now made this disclosure fully and completely. Pause. 3 seconds. The courtroom breathing like a single organism. I am not recusing myself from this case. Spaulding was on his feet before the sentence ended. Required. Obligated. His job demanded it, even though his instinct told him the ground was already gone. Your Honor, with all respect, this creates an unavoidable appearance of impropriety. We move for recusal under 28 U.S.C. Section 455 and the North Carolina Code of Judicial Conduct. Noted for the record, Corinne's response was immediate. Not rushed, but ready. The answer prepared before the question was asked. Motion denied. Canon 3E requires disclosure, which I have provided. Recusal is discretionary unless the presiding officer harbors personal bias that would prevent fair adjudication. I am disclosing the interaction precisely to ensure transparency. The objection is preserved for the appellate record. The trial will proceed. Spaulding remained standing for 2 more seconds. He understood what she was doing, and he understood that it was technically sound. Disclosure satisfied the ethical requirement. Recusal was discretionary, not mandatory, unless bias could be demonstrated. She was daring him to prove she couldn't be fair, and the dare itself was evidence of confidence that no appellate court would overturn easily. He sat down. His hand returned to Hadley's shoulder. Hadley hadn't moved, hadn't breathed visibly, sat like a statue carved from something that was crumbling from the inside. The trial proceeded. Vaughn called her first witness. Jalen Odom walked to the stand, 16 years old, looking 15, scared but credible, the way children are credible when they've been told to tell the truth and have no reason not to. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore, sat down and gripped the armrests of the witness chair with both hands, knuckles tight, the posture of someone bracing for impact he'd already survived once. I was reaching for my registration like he told me to. Jalen's voice shook slightly, not from uncertainty, but from the biological memory of fear stored in the muscles and the bones. He yanked my door open, pulled me out by my shirt. The collar ripped. I hit the ground on my side. Then he put his knee on my back. "Where on your back, Jalen?" Vaughn asked. "Between my shoulder blades. I couldn't breathe right. I kept saying I can't breathe, but he told me to stop talking. He said..." Jalen paused, swallowed hard. "He said if I moved again, he'd make it worse." "How long was his knee on your back?" "The neighbor's video says 43 seconds. It felt longer." "Did you resist at any point?" "No, ma'am. My face was on the sidewalk. My arms were behind me. I was crying." He said this without shame, without the self-consciousness boys his age usually wore like armor. "I was crying because I thought I was going to die on that sidewalk." In the gallery, Jalen's mother pressed a tissue to her mouth. A reporter in the back row stopped typing mid-sentence. Corinne watched the boy's hands on the armrests. The knuckles, the tension, the controlled tremor of a body reliving what it had survived. She recognized the posture. She'd held the same tension in her own hands 12 hours ago on a metal bench in a holding cell. Spaulding cross-examined. He did his job, probing for inconsistency, introducing doubt, using the language of training protocols and officer safety that had been refined over decades to turn force into procedure and procedure into justification. Officer Hadley was responding to what he perceived as furtive movements. "Isn't it true that you reached across the center console?" "I was reaching for the glove compartment, where my registration was, because he told me to get it." "And you made a sudden movement that an officer might reasonably interpret as reaching for a weapon?" "I was getting my papers, like he asked." Jalen's voice steadied, quietly firm. "I'm 16. I don't own a weapon. I was reaching for a piece of paper." Spaulding pressed. "You claim excessive force, but you were treated and released from the emergency room the same night. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. They said nothing was broken, but my back still hurts when it rains, and I can't sleep on my stomach anymore because..." He stopped, blinked rapidly. His jaw moved without producing sound for a moment. Because it feels like someone's still on top of me, even when there's nobody there. Spaulding had the sense to stop. Some answers couldn't be cross-examined away. Some truths were immune to procedural challenge because they lived not in the legal record, but in the body that carried them. Corinne watched, listened. Each piece of testimony landing differently than it would have yesterday, because yesterday she'd been a neutral arbiter evaluating evidence. Today she was evidence herself. She could feel the ghost of Hadley's hand on her shoulder, could feel the car door against her ribcage, could hear the ratchet of cuffs closing on wrists that posed no threat. The parallel was exact. The mechanics identical. A compliant subject. A fabricated justification. Force applied, not because it was necessary, but because it was available. Because the body applying it was larger and the authority behind it was absolute, and nobody watching had the power or the will to stop it. Until now. She leaned forward. Judicial prerogative. Counselor Vaughn, is the prosecution aware of any additional incidents involving Officer Hadley that demonstrate a pattern of conduct relevant to the charges? Vaughn hesitated. Your Honor, we have documentation of prior complaints, but they were all dismissed during supervisory review before reaching. I'm not asking about dismissed complaints. Corinne's voice sharpened, precise, controlled, the verbal equivalent of a scalpel. I'm asking about documented incidents, traffic stops, arrests, uses of force. Vaughn understood. We can request those records from the department. The courtroom doors opened. Detective Frankie Lau walked down the center aisle. Every eye followed her. A woman in a dark suit, carrying a sealed folder with the Internal Affairs Division emblem visible on the cover, walking with the measured pace of someone who understood that the speed of her approach was itself a form of communication. She reached the bench, stood at attention. Detective Lau, Internal Affairs Division. Corinne's voice was formal, acknowledging what the courtroom already saw. State your purpose. Your Honor, Internal Affairs received evidence within the last 24 hours of an incident involving Officer Hadley that demonstrates a pattern of conduct directly relevant to the charges before this court. I have video evidence, audio recordings, and documentary analysis. Chain of custody has been maintained and documented. Spaulding jumped up. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We haven't been provided discovery on any new evidence. Rule 16 of the North Carolina Rules of Criminal Procedure requires, this evidence pertains to an incident that occurred 10 hours ago, Counselor. There has not been time for formal discovery procedures. I'm allowing it under judicial discretion as directly relevant to pattern evidence admissible under North Carolina Rule of Evidence 404. B. Your objection is noted for the record and preserved for appeal. Spaulding sat. He knew he was trapped. The objection was correct, technically, procedurally, by the book. But by the book worked differently when the judge was also the victim, when the evidence was 10 hours old, and when the courtroom gallery included the IA captain and a detective who'd been building a case since 3 a.m. Lau approached the prosecution table. Handed Vaughn a USB drive. Dash cam footage from last night's traffic stop. Officer Owen Ridley's vehicle. Timestamp 23:43 hours, October 29th. Additionally, body camera audio from Officer Hadley's unit recovered from the backup audio channel despite an apparent video malfunction. The word malfunction landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Hadley's head twitched, involuntary, the physical response of a man hearing a word he'd typed into a system 4 hours ago, a word he'd believed would bury the evidence permanently. Vaughn connected the USB drive to the courtroom's display system. The monitor flickered. The footage appeared. Ridley's dash cam, wide angle, I-85, mile marker 58. The Mercedes pulled over, spotlight activation. Hadley approaching, and the gallery could see what Lau had seen at 7 a.m. The body language was wrong before the first word was spoken. Aggressive. Decided. A man walking toward a conclusion, not an investigation. Lau narrated for the record, her voice clinical, stripped of opinion. Subject vehicle Mercedes E-Class, North Carolina registration, pulled over on Interstate 85 southbound. Driver immediately places hands on steering wheel. Visible compliance. No furtive movements. No attempt to flee. Officer Hadley approaches driver's side. Flashlight deployed at face level. The footage continued. Corinne presenting documents. Hadley ignoring them. The registration crumpled and thrown. The gallery gasped. Some of them recognized the woman on the screen. Their neighbor. Their colleague. The person who sat on that bench every morning and listened to their cases with the patient attention that justice required. Then the physical contact. The spin. The slam against the car door. The coat tearing. Corinne's gasp. A single involuntary sound that cut through the courtroom speakers and made Jalen Odom's mother cover her mouth. The handcuffs ratcheting. The timestamp reading 23:48. "Note the timestamp," Corinne said from the bench, her voice clinical, detached, narrating her own assault as if it had happened to someone else. 23:48. Handcuffs applied. Dispatch confirmation of valid registration and clean record does not arrive until 23:51, 3 minutes after the arrest. Officer Hadley arrested me before the system told him there was no reason to. The gallery erupted. Whispers became voices. Voices became protests. The bailiff called for order. It took 40 seconds to restore quiet, 40 seconds during which Hadley sat motionless, sweat darkening the collar of his dress uniform, his eyes fixed on a point on the table that existed only as an alternative to looking at the screen or the bench or anywhere that contained the truth. Vaughn turned to Lau. "You mentioned audio from Officer Hadley's body camera." "Yes." Officer Hadley's upload notes indicated video equipment malfunction. However, the department's body camera system includes a redundant audio channel on a separate circuit. When the video feed was manually disabled, the audio continued recording. Manually disabled, not malfunctioned. The distinction hung in the air like smoke. "Play the audio," Corinne said. The courtroom speakers crackled. Then Hadley's voice filled the room, clear, unambiguous, the voice of a man speaking freely because he believed no one was listening. "People like you always think you can drive cars like this." Silence. "I know exactly what I'm looking at." Silence deeper. Then Corinne's voice on the recording, calm, measured, the same voice currently sitting on the bench. "Officer, this is my vehicle. The registration is valid. You can verify through dispatch." Hadley on the recording, laughing. The laugh echoed through the courtroom speakers, and every person in the gallery heard what that laugh contained. Contempt, amusement, the genuine hilarity of a man who believed the idea of this woman owning that car was a joke worth sharing. "Sure you are. And I'm the governor," Delane's voice. "Process her fully. Document everything." Then the line that ended everything. "She matches the profile perfectly. Expensive car, late night, black woman. We both know how this works." The audio stopped. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something heavier, the collective weight of 40 people processing what they'd just heard. Explicit bias, racial profiling. The conscious, articulated decision to arrest a person based not on evidence, but on appearance, spoken aloud in words that left no room for interpretation, no shelter for alternative explanation, no exit from the plain meaning of the language. Corinne let the silence hold for 5 full seconds. Then her voice cut through it. Controlled fury barely contained behind the professional mask, the anger of a woman who had heard those words while handcuffed in the back of a patrol car and had held her response for 10 hours until this moment. "Officer Hadley, what profile was I matching?" Hadley's mouth opened. A sound came out. Not a word, just the beginning of one. The wreckage of speech. Spaulding's hand clamped on his arm. "Don't." "You will answer questions when addressed by counsel, officer. Not before." Corinne's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Authority at this level didn't require volume. It required precision, and her precision was absolute. "Sit down." Hadley collapsed back into the chair. The chair slid backward on the floor, the legs shrieking against wood. Spaulding pulled him forward, held him in place. Lau presented the next piece, a bound report. The Internal Affairs seal stamped in blue on the cover. "Your Honor, Internal Affairs conducted an emergency analysis of Officer Hadley's activity records from the past 16 months. She opened the report, read from it in the flat, factual cadence of someone delivering findings, not arguments. 9 traffic stops fitting an identical pattern. Luxury vehicles, Mercedes, BMW, Lexus, Tesla. All drivers black. All stops occurring between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Professional appearance documented in 7 of 9 cases. 7 resulted in arrest on suspicion of vehicle theft or fraudulent documentation." She paused, turned a page. All 7 arrests were subsequently dropped. No charges filed in any case. 0 resulted in disciplinary action against Officer Hadley. Vaughn stood. "Your Honor, this establishes a clear, documented pattern of racially motivated selective enforcement," Lau continued. "Additionally, Officer Hadley's personnel file shows 4 formal complaints filed in the past 2 years: excessive force, racial profiling, falsification of incident reports." "And what happened to those complaints, Detective?" Corinne asked. She knew the answer, wanted it on record. "All 4 were expunged from his file on October 8th of this year, 21 days ago, by Boyd Pruitt, Records Division. Without review committee process, without supervisory authorization documented in the system, in violation of Department Policy Section 4.17, which requires a 3-member review panel for any expungement of active complaints." The gallery erupted again. Reporters in the back row reached for phones. This was no longer a single excessive force case. This was systemic. This was the story, the one that would lead the evening news, that would generate investigations, that would force institutional reckoning. This story is far from over, but if you're feeling what I think you're feeling, drop a like right now. It tells us to keep making stories like this. Corinne waited, patient, let the chaos settle on its own schedule. When the noise diminished to a level that allowed speech, she addressed Hadley directly. "Officer Hadley, you arrested me last night for false impersonation of a public official. I was driving home after reviewing case files for this morning's proceedings. Do you know which case I was reviewing?" Silence. Hadley couldn't speak. Physically unable, his throat had closed, his jaw locked, his body refusing to participate in its own destruction. Corinne lifted the case file from the bench, held it up, the red tab visible, the label visible. State versus Hadley. Everyone could see it. "Your case. You arrested the presiding authority in your own trial for a crime that didn't exist, using a pattern of racial profiling you've practiced systematically for 16 months, with a complaint history that your department erased 3 weeks before this proceeding." She set the file down, looked at him. The look lasted 4 seconds, long enough for every person in the courtroom to feel its weight, to understand that this was not judicial theatrics, but the focused, measured anger of a woman who had been handcuffed by this man 11 hours ago and was now holding his future in her hands. "I've heard sufficient evidence." Spaulding rose, one final attempt. "Your Honor, we request continuance to review the newly presented evidence. My client's due process rights. Your client arrested a sitting member of this court on fabricated charges based on racial profiling, Counselor. Due process is exactly what I'm providing. Your motion for continuance is denied. Objection preserved for the record." Spaulding sat. There was nothing left. No procedural foothold. No legal argument. No escape hatch built into the architecture of the system that could save a man who dismantled his own defense 10 hours before trial by arresting the one person whose judgment he needed to survive. Corinne delivered the verdict. "Officer Trent Hadley, I find you guilty of excessive force in the matter of Jalen Odom. The evidence, including the victim's testimony, the cell phone video from the April 18th incident, and the now documented pattern of similar conduct, is overwhelming. This was not an isolated incident. This was standard practice. Hadley's head dropped to the table, forehead against wood. A sound escaped. Low, guttural, the sound of a man whose understanding of himself was being surgically removed. I am also referring your conduct from last night to the District Attorney for Criminal Investigation under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, Deprivation of Civil Rights under Color of Law, and North Carolina General Statute Section 14-230, Willful Failure to Discharge Duties as a Public Officer. She turned her gaze to the gallery, to the back row where Osborne sat with his phone, where Lau sat with her folder. Sergeant Margot Delane is hereby referred to Internal Affairs for supervisory negligence, failure to intervene during the commission of civil rights violations, and enabling a pattern of misconduct through affirmative approval of unlawful arrest procedures. One more. Lieutenant Vernon Greaves is referred to the District Attorney for signing and approving booking documents without verification of probable cause, a potential act of obstruction that facilitated the unlawful detention of a citizen whose identity and credentials he chose not to verify. She paused. Let the referrals settle into the record like nails driven into wood, each one permanent, each one structural, each one a point of failure in a system that had operated on the assumption that no one would ever look. This courtroom operates on evidence, not assumptions, on law, not profile, on justice, not prejudice. She looked at Hadley one final time. He hadn't lifted his head from the table. His shoulders shook in small, rhythmic convulsions, the aftershocks of recognition destroying everything it touched. Officer Hadley, you showed me exactly who you are when you believed no one with authority was watching. Today, I am showing you what accountability looks like when the system is forced to confront its own. The gavel fell. One strike. The sound was absolute. In the gallery, Jalen Odom's mother reached for her son. He was crying, not from pain this time, but from the specific relief of being believed. 7 months of carrying a story that the system had treated as debatable, and a courtroom had just called it the truth. His mother pulled him close. His shoulders shook against hers. Spaulding leaned down to Hadley. His voice was barely audible. We need to leave, now. Eve. Rear exit. Hadley didn't respond. Spaulding gripped his arm and physically lifted him from the chair. Hadley's legs moved on reflex rather than intention, the autonomous locomotion of a body whose pilot had checked out. Papers remained scattered on the defense table. The briefcase lay open on the floor where it had fallen. Spaulding left it. Material possessions were irrelevant now. They moved through the rear corridor. Hadley's shoes scraped the tile, not walking, shuffling, the sound of a man being transported rather than transporting himself. Spaulding kept a hand on his back, steering him around corners, through a fire door, down a stairwell that smelled like industrial cleaner and echoed with every footfall. At the bottom of the stairwell, Hadley stopped, leaned against the cinder block wall. His palms pressed flat against the painted surface, arms locked, head hanging between his shoulders. She was telling the truth, he said. The first coherent sentence he'd produced since seeing her on the bench. His voice was stripped, raw, hoarse, the voice of a man hearing his own words played back and understanding for the first time what they sounded like to everyone else. Spaulding said nothing. There was nothing to say. His client had spoken those words freely, voluntarily, into a recording device he thought he'd disabled, and every syllable was now part of the public record. What happens now? Hadley asked the wall. Now, we prepare for the worst 18 months of your life. DA will take the referral. Federal investigation is possible. Your union rep will assign a defense attorney for the administrative proceedings, separate from the criminal track. You'll need both. Hadley's forehead touched the cinder block, cool against his skin. He stood like that for 10 seconds, breathing in the stairwell air, occupying the last quiet space he'd inhabit before the cameras and the questions and the slow machinery of consequence began to operate. I didn't know who she was. That's not a defense, Trent, that's the point. Across town at the precinct, the news arrived before any official communication. A patrol officer showed Sergeant Margot Delane the Charlotte Observer's live feed on his phone at 10:18 a.m., the press conference already underway, Osborne at the podium, her name mentioned in the second paragraph of the developing story. Delane read the screen. Her face did not change expression. The mask of 18 years held firm, even as the ground shifted beneath it. She set the phone on her desk without comment, removed her badge from her belt, placed it beside the phone. Then she picked up her personal keys, walked to the parking lot, got in her car, and drove home. She did not speak to anyone, did not call her union representative, did not contact an attorney, just drove, 15 minutes through streets she'd patrolled for 2 decades, past intersections where she'd made arrests and written reports and supervised officers and built a career that was now measured not in commendations, but in the single word she'd spoken on a highway shoulder at 11:46 the previous night. Fake. One word, applied to credentials that were real, and from that word, everything else had followed. Lieutenant Vernon Greaves received notification by email at 10:41 a.m. Official Department Correspondence. Subject line, Administrative Leave, Pending Investigation. He read it at his desk, in the same chair where he'd signed Hadley's booking form 12 hours earlier without reading it. He reread the email twice. Then he opened the booking form he'd signed. The same form, still in the system, still bearing his illegible signature, still documenting a probable cause he'd never verified and an identity he'd never confirmed. The form was now evidence, his signature was now a confession, and the 6 words he'd spoken, book her, process, let day shift sort it out, were now the foundation of an obstruction referral that would follow him through whatever remained of his career. He logged out of the system, left his credentials on the desk, walked to his car. The precinct continued operating. Shifts changed. Reports were filed. Coffee was brewed and consumed and brewed again. The system processed its daily intake of human conflict with the same mechanical indifference it had always shown, except now, in the building's corridors and locker rooms and break areas, officers spoke in lower voices, looked at cameras differently, wondered, for the first time in years, whether the things they'd always done might one day be the things that ended them. The aftermath moved fast. Outside the courthouse, the media had already assembled. Someone in the gallery had texted a reporter during the disclosure, and the reporter had texted a producer, and the producer had sent a truck. By the time Corinne's gavel fell, 3 cameras were set up on the courthouse steps, and 4 more were incoming. Captain Dwight Osborne stood at a podium hastily assembled on the courthouse plaza. Microphone, department seal on the front panel, the posture of a man performing damage control while simultaneously understanding that the damage was already irreversible. The Mecklenburg County Police Department takes all allegations of misconduct with utmost seriousness. He read from notes. Carefully, each word reviewed by the department's legal counsel in a frantic phone call conducted while he walked from the courtroom to the steps. Officer Trent Hadley has been suspended without pay effective immediately, pending criminal investigation by the district attorney's office. A reporter shouted from the second row. Captain, was this retaliation? Did Officer Hadley target the judge because she was presiding over his case? That question is part of the ongoing investigation. If evidence supports a charge of witness intimidation or obstruction of justice, federal charges may apply. The FBI's Civil Rights Division has been notified. Another reporter. What about the pattern? Detective Lau mentioned 9 incidents in 16 months. A comprehensive review of all traffic stops conducted by Officer Hadley over the past 3 years is underway. Any individuals who believe they were subjected to similar misconduct are encouraged to contact Internal Affairs directly. He gave the phone number, read it twice. The number would ring 47 times before end of business that day. 23 of those calls would describe interactions that matched the pattern precisely. Luxury vehicles, black drivers, late-night stops, arrests on fabricated suspicion, charges dropped within 24 hours. A third reporter, from the Charlotte Observer. Captain, the complaints that were expunged, who authorized Boyd Pruitt to access those files? Osborne's jaw tightened. That is under active internal affairs investigation. I can't comment on specifics, but I can confirm that the expungement process did not follow established department policy, and the individual responsible has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of that investigation. The questions continued. Osborne answered what he could, deflected what he couldn't. The press conference lasted 14 minutes, long enough to establish the official narrative, short enough to avoid the questions that had no safe answers. Inside the courthouse, the hallway outside courtroom 3 had emptied. Spaulding had escorted Hadley through the rear exit, the prisoner's corridor, ironically, to avoid cameras. Hadley walked like a man carrying something invisible and impossibly heavy, his feet dragging, his shoulders collapsed forward. The dress uniform that had looked crisp 2 hours ago now wrinkled and darkened with sweat. Spaulding said nothing during the walk. There was nothing to say. His client had been found guilty of excessive force, referred for federal criminal investigation, and publicly identified as a serial racial profiler whose department had covered his tracks, all before 10 a.m. The appellate arguments were already forming in his mind. The recusal issue, the discovery objection, the pattern evidence ruling, but he knew, with the cold certainty of 21 years in courtrooms, that appeals were measured in months and years, and the damage done today was measured in seconds. Side exit, parking lot. Owen Ridley walked toward his personal vehicle with his head down, keys in his hand, trying to reach his car before anyone noticed him. "Officer Ridley." He stopped, turned. Corinne Bellamy stood 15 feet away. She'd exited through the judicial corridor, the one that connected her chambers to the side parking lot. She was still wearing what she'd worn on the bench, the garment that had transformed the woman from the highway into the authority in the courtroom. Ridley's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: recognition, fear, shame. "Your Honor, The word stuck. He swallowed, tried again. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up. Last night, on the highway. I should have stopped it. I should have said something." She looked at him, not with anger, not with forgiveness, with something more complex, the assessment of a woman who understood the difference between cowardice and paralysis, between complicity and the failure of courage, and who hadn't yet decided which category this young officer occupied. "You kept your camera running," she said. "You uploaded the footage at 2:51 a.m. You wrote, 'Please review' in the supplemental report." He nodded, eyes red, jaw working. "That mattered. What you did after mattered." She paused. Let the sentence stand on its own. "But Officer Ridley, the next time you're standing 15 feet away and watching someone's rights being violated, after isn't going to be enough. During is what changes outcomes. Do you understand?" He nodded again. This time his eyes held hers. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." She turned, walked back toward the building, then stopped, half-turned. "Detective Lau tells me Internal Affairs is looking for officers willing to transfer to the investigative division. The work is difficult. Your colleagues won't like you for doing it. You won't be popular." She let that hang for a moment. "Think about it." She disappeared through the side door. Ridley stood in the parking lot for another 2 minutes, keys in his hand, staring at the space where she'd stood. The October wind moved through the lot, scattering a few leaves across the asphalt, carrying the sound of reporters' questions from the front of the building. He thought about his father, about his mother, about the moment on the highway when he'd seen what was happening and done nothing, the moment that would live in his memory as the dividing line between the officer he'd been and the officer he was deciding to become. He got in his car, didn't start the engine, sat with his hands on the wheel, 10 and 2, the same position Corinne had held when the blue lights first appeared in her mirror. Then he pulled out his phone and composed an email. 2. Detective F. Lau, Internal Affairs Division. From Officer O. Ridley, Patrol Division. Subject, Transfer Inquiry. Detective Lau. I'd like to discuss opportunities in IA. When is a good time to meet? O. Ridley. He hit send before he could change his mind. 4:17 p.m. Detective Frankie Lau sat at her desk. The day had been the longest of her career, and in 14 years of investigating officers who broke laws while wearing badges, that was a high bar. The case file had tripled in size since morning. Statements from Jalen Odom's attorney, formal complaints initiated against Delane and Greaves, a preservation order for all electronic records related to Hadley's traffic stops, a request to the IT division for forensic analysis of the dashcam server, specifically the 12-minute segment of Ridley's footage that had been corrupted between its upload at 2:51 a.m. and Lau's access at 7:12 a.m. The IT report had arrived at 3:46 p.m. Lau read it twice. The corrupted segment had not suffered random data degradation. The corruption pattern was consistent with the application of a data modification tool, specifically a filter available through the department's records management software, accessible only to users with system administrator credentials. The IT specialist had identified the terminal used, WH-records-03. The access log showed a single session, 2:47 a.m. to 3:01 a.m. User, B. Prewitt. Boyd. Prewitt had corrupted 12 minutes of dashcam footage 4 hours before Lau discovered it. 12 minutes that captured the most damning portion of the stop: the briefcase search, the discovery of Corinne's credentials, Delane's order to add the false impersonation charge. Lau opened Prewitt's personnel file. Employment history, 6 years in records, access level, system administrator. Prior disciplinary actions, none. Supervisor, department records chief, who reported to... Lau traced the chain upward. Deputy Chief Nolan Sharp. She wrote the name on her legal pad, drew a box around it, then drew a line from the box to the word Prewitt, and another line from Prewitt to the word expungement, and another from expungement to the word Hadley. The lines formed a triangle, and triangles, in Lau's experience, were never accidents. She picked up her phone, called Osborne. "Captain, the IT report is back on the corrupted footage. It wasn't random. Someone used records management software to degrade the file between 3 and 7 a.m. Terminal traces back to Boyd Prewitt." Silence. Then Osborne's voice, lower now, the register of a man who understood that a case about one officer was becoming a case about a system. "Same Prewitt who expunged the complaints." "Same Prewitt, same night, same terminal. Captain, someone called Prewitt at 2:15 a.m. and told him to clean up. The complaint expungement, the footage corruption, this wasn't initiative. This was coordinated." "Who called him?" "His department phone log is clean. But IT found a secondary device, a prepaid cell, listed in his personal vehicle inventory from a prior traffic accident report. We're running the IMEI now." "What do you need?" "A warrant for the prepaid phone records. And Captain, I need to talk to you about Deputy Chief Sharp." Another silence, longer this time. The silence of a man weighing institutional loyalty against institutional accountability and finding the two incompatible. "What about him?" "Prewitt reports up through Sharp's division. The expungements, the server access, all within Sharp's chain of command. And today, during the biggest internal misconduct event this department has faced in a decade, Sharp was absent. Not in the courtroom, not at the press conference, not in the building. He's on scheduled leave. His leave wasn't filed until 8:22 this morning, Captain, 19 minutes before the hearing started. I pulled the leave calendar. There's no prior entry. Someone told Sharp what was about to happen, and he removed himself from the building to avoid association." "That's speculation, Detective." "It's a timeline. Timelines don't speculate. They record." She could hear Osborne breathing on the other end. The rasp of a man whose morning coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago, and whose world had rearranged itself around facts he couldn't dismiss. "There's something else," Lau continued. "I ran Sharp's email traffic for the past 90 days. Internal system. Everything's archived. He sent Prewitt 14 messages in the past 6 weeks. Standard correspondence for the first 11. Records requests, filing protocols, administrative assignments. But messages 12 through 14 were sent at unusual hours: 10:47 p.m., 11:31 p.m., 1:15 a.m. Subject lines blank. Body text encrypted using the department's secure communication protocol, which means we need IT to decrypt, which means we need a warrant for that too. Internal encryption falls under administrative privilege unless there's reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. I believe we've crossed that threshold. You think Sharp ordered the cleanup? I think Sharp has been managing Hadley's file for longer than 3 weeks. I think the 4 complaints weren't the first things Prewitt expunged on Sharp's direction. And I think that when the prepaid phone records come back, the 2:15 a.m. call is going to trace to someone inside Sharp's office. Maybe Sharp himself. Maybe someone acting on his authority. File for both warrants. I'll authorize. And Lau. Yes, Captain. Be careful. Sharp has 25 years and a lot of friends. If you're right about this, the pushback won't come from him directly. It'll come from the people who owe him. Understood. I've been doing this for 14 years, Captain. Pushback is the part of the job that means you're getting close. She hung up, turned back to her monitor. The triangle on her legal pad, Prewitt, Hadley, Sharp, looked different now. Less like a triangle and more like the visible portion of something larger. The 3 points above the surface. The structure below still hidden, still unmapped, still operating in the confidence that no one was looking. But Lau was looking, and she had the patience and the access and the institutional protection, for now, to keep looking until the structure revealed itself. She opened a new folder on her encrypted drive, named it Operation Pattern, began compiling. Osborne exhaled. A long, slow sound. The sound of a man who'd started the morning thinking he was managing a single officer's misconduct and was now staring at something with roots that went deeper than any single arrest or any single highway or any single night. File for the warrant. I'll authorize it. And Lau, document everything, triple redundant, encrypted backups. If this goes where I think it's going, people are going to try to make evidence disappear. Already done, Captain. First thing I did this morning. She hung up, turned back to her monitor. The triangle on her legal pad stared back at her. Prewitt, Hadley, Sharp. 3 points connected by lines that might extend further into territories she hadn't mapped yet. But that was the job. Brick by brick. Fact by fact. Following the lines wherever they led, even when they led into the offices of people who outranked her and could end her career with a single phone call. She opened her email. A new message had arrived. From Owen Ridley. Transfer inquiry. She read it. Smiled. The first time she'd smiled in 26 hours. Then she typed a reply. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. My office. Bring coffee. You're going to need it. Hi. 5:45 p.m. The Odom residence. Westinghouse neighborhood, East Charlotte. Jalen sat at the kitchen table, still wearing the button-down shirt his mother had ironed that morning. The shirt was too big. His mother had bought it with room to grow, the optimism of a parent who still measured time and how tall her son would eventually become, rather than what had already been done to him. He was eating cereal. Not because he was hungry, his mother had offered to cook, had offered 3 times, but because cereal was simple, and simple was what he needed after a day that had contained more complexity than his 16 years had prepared him for. His phone sat face down on the table. It had been buzzing since noon. Classmates, neighbors, strangers who'd found his name in the news coverage and wanted to tell him they were proud or outraged, or that they'd experienced the same thing, or that he should be grateful the system worked. Grateful. The word stuck in his throat like a fishbone. The system hadn't worked. The system had put an officer's knee on his back and then spent 7 months debating whether the knee was justified. The system had dismissed 4 prior complaints against the same officer and then expunged them entirely. The system had only confronted itself today because the officer had made the colossal error of arresting the one person with the authority to force a reckoning. If Trent Hadley had pulled over anyone else on I-85 last night, anyone without a gavel and a case file, and the composure of a woman who'd spent her career learning how institutions break, there would have been no disclosure, no evidence cascade, no gavel strike. Just another report filed, another arrest dropped, another entry in a pattern that nobody with power was tracking. Jalen knew this. He was 16, not naive. He'd understood it in the ambulance 7 months ago, with pavement grit still embedded in his cheek and his back throbbing in rhythms that matched his heartbeat. He'd understood that the encounter hadn't been about him, about his actions, his compliance, his wallet in the glove compartment. It had been about something older and larger, a current that ran beneath the surface of every interaction between people who looked like him and people who wore badges. The guilty verdict helped. He wouldn't deny that. It helped the way antibiotic helps infection. It treated the symptom, reduced the swelling, made the surface look healthier. But the infection itself, the culture, the training, the profile, the assumption, that lived deeper than any single verdict could reach. His mother came into the kitchen, set a hand on his shoulder. Not a grip, a presence. The weight of someone who loved him and couldn't protect him and knew both things simultaneously. "You did good today," she said. He nodded, poured more cereal. The phone buzzed again. He left it face down. 7:43 p.m. The Bellamy residence. Dilworth. The house was quiet. Julian had ordered takeout. Thai, Corinne's preference, the kind of food that required no conversation because the flavors did the talking. They sat on the living room couch, containers on the coffee table, the television off, the only sound the distant hum of Charlotte evening traffic filtering through windows that needed new weather stripping. Corinne held a glass of wine. Red. Half full. She'd been holding it for 12 minutes without drinking. Julian sat beside her, close enough to touch but not touching, reading the space between them with the precision of a man who'd learned over 14 years of marriage that proximity was not the same as presence, and that sometimes the most supportive thing you could do was simply be in the room without requiring anything. "Are you okay?" he asked, quietly. "Not professionally okay, not legally okay. You." She looked at him. The mask she'd worn all day, the bench mask, the composure mask, the I am the system mask, was gone. What remained was the face underneath. Tired, angry, bruised in places that didn't show. "I'm tired," she said. "The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix." "I know." "I sat in a cell for 7 hours, Julian, on a metal bench, with my wrists cut up from cuffs that were too tight on purpose. And the whole time, I was doing the math. Calculating timelines, sequencing evidence, building the case in my head, because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. Turn the injury into the instrument." She took a sip of wine, set the glass down. "But underneath the math, underneath the strategy, I was scared. Not of them. Of the fact that it worked. That the system did exactly what it was designed to do. Swallow someone whole, process them, spit them out, and move on without a single person in the chain asking whether any of it was justified." Julian took her hand. She let him. "What you did today..." "What I did today was the minimum. 1 officer suspended. 1 case adjudicated. Referrals that may or may not result in prosecution, because the DA's office is understaffed and selective, and federal investigations take 18 months on a good timeline. Delane will probably get a reprimand. Greaves will claim he didn't read what he signed. And Prewitt..." She shook her head. "Prewitt is a symptom. Someone told him to clean those files. Someone above him. And until we know who made that call, we haven't solved anything. We've just documented it. You documented it. That matters. It matters if something comes of it. Documentation without consequence is just archives." They sat in silence for a while. The wine warmed in the glass. The takeout cooled on the table. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. "There will be pushback," Julian said. "Appellate motions, union grievances, probably a formal complaint against you for not recusing." "I know. And there'll be retaliation, subtle, the kind that comes through reassigned cases and leaked information and colleagues who suddenly can't make eye contact. I know that too. She turned to him. But the record exists now. The audio exists. The pattern is documented. 9 stops, 7 false arrests, 4 expunged complaints, and a body camera that someone thought they'd turned off but hadn't. She picked up the wine glass. This time she drank. That's what I keep coming back to. He turned off the camera. Deliberately. Because he'd done it before. Because it was routine. Just another step in the process of being wrong and never being caught. And the only reason it failed this time is because a redundancy system on page 47 of an equipment manual caught what 47 pages of policy and oversight and institutional accountability didn't. Page 47. Page 47. That's what justice came down to. A technical specification that nobody read. Julian looked at her. No. Justice came down to you. To the fact that you sat in that cell and chose strategy over rage. To the fact that you walked into that courtroom and did the hardest thing anyone can do, hold power over the person who hurt you, and use it fairly instead of as a weapon. She didn't answer immediately. The word fairly sat between them, carrying weight she wasn't sure she agreed with. She'd been fair, technically, procedurally, legally. She'd disclosed. She'd allowed objections. She'd preserved the appellate record. But had she been fair, or had she been strategic? Was there a difference? She didn't know, and she suspected that question would follow her for a long time, through the investigation, through the hearings, through whatever came next in a process that was just beginning and might take years to reach anything resembling conclusion. I'm going to keep the scratches, she said. What? On the car, the door handle, where the cuffs scraped the chrome. I'm going to tell the dealer to leave them. Julian looked at her. Some reminders are worth keeping. 9:22 p.m. Corinne's home office, 2nd floor. She sat at her desk, reviewing the next day's docket. The work didn't stop. Justice didn't sleep. And neither did the caseload. 3 hearings scheduled for Wednesday, 2 motions to review, a sentencing memo that required her attention by end of week. The machinery of the court continued operating regardless of what had happened in courtroom 3, regardless of the news cameras and the press conferences and the internal affairs investigation spreading through the department like water finding cracks in a foundation. She opened her email. 47 new messages since noon. Colleagues, attorneys, reporters, the Chief Justice's office, requesting a formal written account of the disclosure. She'd respond tomorrow. Tonight, she needed one thing. Silence. But one email stopped her. No subject line. Sender, a departmental address. The format was correct, the domain authentic, but the name field was blank, just @mec.gov. One line in the body. Judge Bellamy, you should ask who called in the original tip to dispatch. It wasn't random, no signature, no name, no department, just 10 words and an implication that rearranged everything she'd assumed about last night. The anonymous 911 call. Luxury vehicle, I-85 South, probably stolen. She'd categorized it as random bias. A civilian who saw a nice car and a black driver and reached for the phone because the combination triggered an assumption. It happened. It happened constantly. It was the background radiation of American driving while black, so common it barely registered as noteworthy. But if someone called it in deliberately, if someone knew she'd be on I-85 that night, at that hour, driving that car, if someone knew she was reviewing the Hadley case file and wanted to create a confrontation, or an arrest, before she reached the bench in the morning. If the call wasn't random, then the stop wasn't random. And if the stop wasn't random, then the arrest wasn't misconduct. It was strategy, obstruction, witness intimidation directed at a sitting judge on the eve of trial. Federal. She stared at the screen. The cursor blinked at the end of the email, a small mechanical pulse in a dark room, asking a question she couldn't answer. Who sent this? Someone inside the department. Someone who knew details about the dispatch call that hadn't been made public. The time, the content, the absence of identifying information. someone with access to dispatch logs and the knowledge to interpret them, someone who wanted her to keep pulling the thread. She closed the laptop, sat in the dark. The desk lamp was off. The only light came from the hallway, a thin strip under the door, the ambient glow of a house settling into night, the scratches on her car door, the bruises on her wrists, the 12 minutes of corrupted footage, the expunged complaints, the deputy chief who filed leave 19 minutes before the hearing, and now an anonymous email suggesting the entire encounter was engineered. One night, one traffic stop, one arrest that shouldn't have happened. And underneath it, layers, connections. A system that didn't just tolerate misconduct but organized it, funded it, protected it, and cleaned up after it with the practiced efficiency of an institution that had been doing this for longer than any single officer's career. Corinne sat in the dark and thought about page 47, about redundancy systems and backup audio channels, and the accidental architecture of accountability that caught what intentional architecture missed. She thought about Jalen Odom, 16 years old, whose back still ached when it rained. She thought about 9 traffic stops and 7 false arrests and 4 complaints that someone had erased in the middle of the night because the morning was coming and the morning required clean records. She thought about Owen Ridley, standing 15 feet away, saying nothing, keeping his camera running, the smallest possible act of conscience in a system designed to punish conscience and reward silence. And she thought about the email, the unsigned message from someone inside a machine that was trying to protect itself, who had chosen, at some risk for some reason, to tell a judge that the machine was more broken than she knew. Outside, Charlotte continued. 800,000 people driving home, eating dinner, putting children to bed, watching screens, living lives that didn't intersect with what had happened in courtroom 3. The city hummed. The highway she'd been arrested on carried traffic in both directions, southbound and northbound, arriving and departing, the same stretch of asphalt that looked different now but wasn't because roads didn't change. Only the people driving on them did. The bruises on her wrists would fade. The scratches on the car door would stay. And somewhere in the records division server, a 14-minute access log sat in a partition that most people couldn't reach, but someone could. Someone who knew where to look. Someone who understood that the system's greatest vulnerability was not the people who broke it, but the records it kept of how the breaking was done. Boyd Pruitt's prepaid phone was in an evidence bag now. The warrant was pending. The IMEI trace was running, and when the records came back, when the call at 2:15 a.m. was traced to its origin, another name would surface. Another thread would extend the triangle on Lau's legal pad into a shape with more sides and sharper angles. But that was tomorrow. That was the next case, the next hearing, the next brick in a wall that might take years to build and might never reach high enough to contain what it was designed to hold. Tonight, Corinne Bellamy sat in her home office in the dark, wearing the bruises of a system she'd sworn to serve, holding the evidence of its failure in a case file that bore the name of the man who'd put her in handcuffs, knowing that justice was not a destination, but a process. Slow, imperfect, perpetually incomplete. She'd started something today. Whether it would be finished, whether the investigation would reach sharp, whether the federal referrals would produce indictments, whether the expunged complaints would be restored and the corrupted footage recovered and the anonymous tipster identified, she didn't know. No one knew. That was the nature of the thing. Justice didn't announce its schedule. It moved at the speed of institutions, which was the speed of paperwork and warrants and budget allocations and political will moved at the speed of public attention, and public attention moved at the speed of the next story. But the record existed. The audio existed. And somewhere in the Mecklenburg County Police Department, a young officer named Owen Ridley was reading a reply to his email, learning that he had a meeting at 8 a.m. with Detective Lau, and thinking about what his father had told him the day he graduated from the academy, about the kind of officer his mother needed him to be. The work would continue. The cases would come. The system would resist and adapt and protect itself the way systems always did. Through inertia, through procedure, through the quiet cooperation of people who'd decided that their pensions mattered more than their principles. And Corinne Bellamy would be there. On the bench, in the robes, holding the gavel. Not because the system was fair, but because someone had to sit where she sat and do what she did, imperfectly, exhaustingly, without guarantee of outcome, because the alternative was a bench with no one on it, and that was something she refused to allow. She stood up, walked to the window. Charlotte at night, lights stretching to the horizon, the skyline glowing against low clouds, the highway visible as a river of headlights and taillights flowing in opposite directions. She placed her hand on the glass, cool against her palm. The bruise on her right wrist was visible, a dark band, the color of storm clouds, the shape of a handcuff. She looked at it. Then she turned off the hallway light, walked to the bedroom where Julian was already asleep, and lay down beside him, and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, not yet. To think about tomorrow. If this story moved you, share it. Not for us. For everyone who's been pulled over and knew something was wrong but had no power to prove it. The Corinne Bellamys are real. The Jalen Odoms are real. And the system only changes when enough people refuse to look away. This story is fiction. The patterns it describes are not. Every year in America, thousands of traffic stops begin the same way, with an assumption made before the window rolls down. The car is too nice. The hour is too late. The driver doesn't match the picture in someone's head. And from that assumption, an entire architecture of violation unfolds. Fabricated justifications, procedural shortcuts, reports written to match narratives instead of facts. What Corinne Bellamy had was power, authority, the specific gravity of a position that forced people to listen when she spoke. Most people who experience what she experienced don't have that. They have the metal bench and the fluorescent lights and the cold phone call at 2 a.m., but they don't have the courtroom. They don't have the gavel. They don't have the capacity to turn their victimization into accountability within the same institution that victimized them. That's the uncomfortable truth this story asks you to sit with. Justice shouldn't require that the victim outranks the perpetrator. It shouldn't depend on the accident of who someone turns out to be. A system that only corrects itself when the person it harms happens to hold institutional power is not a system of justice. It's a system of luck. The lesson is not be powerful enough to fight back. The lesson is build systems where fighting back isn't required, where the camera stays on, where the complaint isn't expunged, where dispatch confirmation matters more than instinct, where page 47 gets read. Be the person who reads page 47. Be the Owen Ridley who keeps the camera running. Be the Frankie Lau who opens the file at 3 a.m. Be the citizen who demands that accountability isn't optional and oversight isn't performative. Because justice isn't just what happens in courtrooms. It's what happens on highways, in holding cells, in records division servers at 2:47 in the morning, in every quiet moment when someone decides whether to look away or look closer. Choose closer, every time.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.